Whoa. Okay. Coming on. How's it going? Anybody out here this morning? Hello? I am really working on, getting my schedule and equilibrium going where I'm producing. Uh, Getting on that thing at 4:30, and part of doing that is getting up at 3, which means I gotta go to bed at 7 at night. Um, or else take multiple naps. And I'm sort of easing towards managing to get up and start my stream at 4:30 a.m. because I got to take care of my daughter as soon as she gets up. Um, she's on Roblox Studio and she's like building her game or whatever, and I'm sitting there with a thing of oatmeal, spoon feeding her. That's She's like very absorbed in her work. Yeah, I'm like, this is great. Um, but yeah, I was just shout out to Medhu, uh, an old 3D friend of mine. I was trying to get a message through to him. For people that I did 3D animation, most of my life, and the game is really changing. Like I've just decided to, in the last year, to sort of come back to graphics in 3D. Circumstances have led to this situation. That's like it's really my daughter. Um, what can I say? If I did 3D all my life and then I have this kid and then she's all into 3D, it's like, how can you stand in the way of that? you know, because I got to a point in my life where this is kind of a mistake, because I felt like a lot of I taught 3D in China, and I saw Chinese kids that were working in studios, base effects studio in particular, nasty place. They're just getting burned up like match heads, man. They're in Beijing on a residence permit. They don't have a Beijing, they're not born in Beijing, so they got to have a work permit to live in Beijing. And so foreign companies go there and exploit the hell out of them. And strategically, long term, it's good for China. When these things blow up, like if a foreign company is running an operation in Beijing, and it gets to a point where people are in the streets or whatever, the government will step in and say, "Oh, one of these abuses you've been doing, double everybody's salary or close down." People, Westerners are so they're not strategic thinkers anymore. I don't think. I saw that done really to Japanese companies. They were allowed to when I was living in China, there were Japanese. I want to say it was Mitsubishi. I'm not sure. It's been so long now that I forgot. But 2 auto manufacturers got shut down because Chinese workers were demonstrating in the streets. And strategically, what China has done is they've offered an environment for a foreign company to bring the technology in for them, and then China can observe it and study it, right? And there's a process because Chinese culture is very different, and the Chinese people have to first learn how things are being done, and then they have to come up with the Chinese way of doing it, and then that's the way that eventually it's going to be implemented. But you may think, that when you go in there that it's like, yeah, we can do whatever we want. We can exploit these people or whatever. When, the Chinese are watching your behavior. And when you go too far, they're going to come down on the side of their own people. And strategically, it's advantageous for the leadership to do so. If you don't like it, your factory is in China. Bye. Go away. Well, we'll just take it from here. Get it? You should have been giving people a fair deal in the first place. Rushing to China because you can rip people off. That's what you don't like it when you get ripped off, but you're damn sure ready to rip off some Chinese guy from Gansu province, not pay him decent wages. Anyway, so here I am, and I gotta start Mech Arena. Let's see. Let's see. It's launching. Yeah. Is like, oh my goodness. No, it's supposed to be streaming. And I do believe I am. Okay, so I'm going to try something different this morning. I'm just going to get my book going. Clay.
Several fortresses belonging to the Franks, and the destruction of the German colonies was still the aim of all his labors and all his exploits. Full of confidence in the protection of Muhammad, the devout, Nureddin employed his leisure in constructing, with his own hands, a pulpit, which he meant himself to place in the principal mosque of Jerusalem. The Sultan of Damascus was preparing to commence what the Muslims called a sacred war, and for the success of which public prayers had been offered up, but this glory was reserved for a young warrior, brought up in armies, whose name was yet unknown in the East. Saladin, 298, this young warrior, was sprung from the people who inhabit the mountains situated beyond the Tigris. His father Ayyub, and his uncle Chirku, after the example of the warriors of their nation, who fight for pay under Muslim powers, had left Kurdistan to serve in the troops of the Sultan of Baghdad. They had both attained high military employments. But Chirku, a violent and brutal man, having run through the body with his sword an officer of justice, the two brothers were obliged to take to flight, and came to offer their services to the Atabegs of Syria, whom they assisted in their wars against the Christians. The young Saladin, although he was brought up at the court of Damascus, under the eye of an ambitious father, did not at first appear to be eager for either fortune or glory. In his youth he was fond of dissipation and pleasures, and remained a long time a stranger to the cares of politics or the dangers and labors of war. Having followed his uncle Chirku in his first expeditions to Egypt, he had distinguished himself by the defense of Alexandria. But he suffered so much that when Nureddin commanded him to return to the banks of the Nile, he sought pretexts to avoid obedience. When the Sultan repeated his orders, Saladin set out, as he himself said afterwards, with a despair of a man who is led to death. Thus it is, says the historian, Hamet Eddin, who was for a long time his secretary, that men know not what they refuse or what they desire. But God, who knows all things, sports with their designs, which always terminate according to the views of providence. At the death of Cherku, the Caliph of Egypt, who trembled for his power, named Saladin to the post of vizier, because he thought him the least capable, by his talents or reputation, of usurping the supreme authority. The son of Ayyub deceived both the king and the army, who saw in him nothing but a young dissipated soldier, without ambition. But he changed his conduct and reformed his manners. Hitherto he had appeared fit only for the idleness and the obscurity of a seraglio. But, all at once, he came forth a new man, like one born for empire. His gravity inspired the respect of the emirs. His liberality secured him the suffrages of the army. And the austerity of his devotion rendered him dear to all true believers. A religious revolution which he brought about without trouble or the effusion of blood, made known his prudence and humanity, and showed that fortune destined him for extraordinary things. The Caliph of Baghdad felicitated him publicly with having annihilated the sect of the Fatimites, and made him a present of a vest of honor. His name was celebrated by the poets, and mixed with those of Muhammad and Nureddin in the public prayers. Saladin, master of Egypt, sent for his father Ayyub, and wished to associate him with himself in the government. When Ayyub arrived at Cairo with all his family, he was compared to Jacob, and Saladin to the patriarch Joseph, whose name he bore. Aided by the counsels of his father, Saladin stifled all plots devised against him, and restrained the ambition and jealousy of the emirs. In a council in which his son had spoken too openly of his projects, Ayyub, brought up among the intrigues of the courts of Asia, exclaimed with vehemence against all traitors, and swore he would cut off the head of even Saladin himself, if he received orders from the Sultan of Damascus to do so. When left alone with his son, he reproached him with his indiscretion and imprudence. "I have spoken against you," added he, "before your rivals and enemies. But know that if Nureddin should come to attack you, I would be the first to take arms. If he required only the tribute of a sugar cane from us, he should not obtain it of me." According to the advice of Ayyub, Saladin spoke only of his perfect submission to the commands of his master, and took honor to himself as being the lowest of the slaves of Nureddin, to whom he sent deputies and presents. But he could not destroy all his suspicions. Nureddin had determined upon going into Egypt himself, when death surprised him, and delivered Saladin from the uneasiness which a jealous and vindictive master naturally inspired. At the death of Nureddin, the empire founded by the Atabeeks declined towards its ruin. The Sultan of the Atabeeks only left a child to succeed him. The emirs already began to quarrel for the divisions of his power, and Syria was about to return to the chaos into which the fall of the Seljukids had plunged it. The Mussulman nations, terrified at the evils before them, eagerly sought the yoke of Saladin, and recognized with joy for their master a warrior who was the only person capable of defending their religion or their dominions. Saladin inherited not only the power of Nureddin, but was anxious to follow up the projects of his predecessor, and nothing pleased his ambition more than the idea of pursuing the war against the Christians. Amori, instead of taking advantage of the troubles of Syria, was desirous of resuming his projects against Egypt, and requesting the aid of the Emperor of Constantinople. The latter sent him a fleet and some troops. The Christians laid siege to Damietta, but the eternal divisions between the Greeks and Latins prevented the success of the enterprise. Amori, entertaining still the hope of succeeding in his designs, sent ambassadors into Europe, thinking that the prospect of the conquest of Egypt would arm the knights of the West. As the deputies of the Mori returned without obtaining aid, he himself repaired to Constantinople to solicit fresh succors. He was received with magnificence, and great promises were made him. But he died without seeing them realized. Thus King Amori, during the whole of his reign, had but one single thought, for which he exhausted all the resources of his kingdom. The obstinacy which he evinced for the execution of an unfortunate project advanced the progress of the Mussulmans, and must have recalled to the Christians of the West the words which the prophets repeated to the Hebrews, children of Israel: direct neither your looks nor your steps towards Egypt. Amori, at his death, left a distressed kingdom, and as the governor of it states a son, 13 years of age, sick and covered with leprosy. Raymond, Count of Tripoli, and Malo de Planty, Lord of Carrick and Montreal, disputed the regency during the minority of young Baldwin Malo. By his intrigues, obtained the suffrages of the barons, but was found, a short time after, pierced with several wounds inflicted by a sword. In one of the streets of Ptolemy, Raymond succeeded his rival, with whose death all Palestine accused him. The father of the Count of Tripoli had been killed by the Ismailians, and he himself had remained 8 years in the chains of the infidels. The fourth in descent from the famous Count de Saint-Gilles, he possessed the bravery, the activity, and the ambition of the hero from whom he drew his origin. But with them, that obstinacy of character, which, in difficult times, irritates the passions and provokes implacable patrons. More impatient to reign over the Christians than to conquer the infidels, Raymond considered the right of commanding men as the only reward of the evils he had suffered. He demanded with hotness the recompense of his services and his long toils, and conceived that justice would triumph and the safety of the kingdom be preserved solely by his elevation. If, amidst the disorders which continually agitated the Christian states, the new regent had had sufficient authority to direct the policy of the Franks, and make peace or war at his will, history might justly accuse him of having favored the power of Saladin, and of having prepared the downfall of the kingdom of Jerusalem. After the death of Nureddin, the son of Aelkid had to contend with the family of his old master, the emirs faithful to the dynasty of the Atabeeks, and all who wished to profit by the troubles of Syria and erect independent states for themselves. Prudence commanded the Christians to foment the discord which prevailed among the Saracens, and to ally themselves with every party which was opposed to Saladin. Instead of following this wholesome policy, and stirring up war in Syria, they determined upon renewing Amori's unfortunate attempts upon Egypt. A Sicilian fleet having arrived in Palestine, aided by the Sicilians, the Christians laid siege to Alexandria, where all sorts of miseries combined to destroy their army. Frequently repeated reverses conveyed no instruction to the Franks of the proper manner to make war with Saladin. As they were returning from their imprudent and unfortunate expedition, the Mussulman governor of the city of Emesa, then besieged by the new Sultan of Damascus, solicited their alliance and support. The Christian warriors, after having placed a price upon their services, which it was impossible the governor could pay, entered upon the campaign, without an object, threatening those they pretended to defend, and ravaging at the same time the territories of their allies and their enemies. Nevertheless, their presence in Syria, and their transient alliance with the Mussulman princes, alarmed Saladin, who was making war against the son of Nureddin, shut up in the city of Aleppo. The Sultan, resolving to keep them at a distance from the theater of his conquests, made their leaders brilliant promises and rich presents, and soon succeeded in obtaining a truce, of which he took advantage to strengthen his power and extend the limits of his empire. The Franks returned to Jerusalem, satisfied with having compelled Saladin to ask for peace. After having imprudently consented to a truce, they committed a second fault, which was to violate the treaty they had just signed, and that not to undertake an important enterprise, but to make an incursion into the territories of Damascus. They ravaged the country, and pillaged the towns and villages that they found without defense, while Saladin continued making useful conquests in Syria, and rendering himself sufficiently powerful to punish them for the infraction of their engagements. The Sultan of Cairo and Damascus soon assembled a formidable army and advanced towards Palestine. The whole country was in flames through which the Saracens passed. At their approach the Christians abandoned the cities and towns to take refuge in mountains and caverns. Baldwin, 4. who had recently assumed the reins of government, placed himself at the head of the Franks. But fearing to measure himself with Saladin, he shut himself up in Ascalon, whence he contemplated with consternation his desolated provinces. Everything appeared to presage the approaching fall of the kingdom, and Saladin was already distributing its cities among his emirs, when Providence, which at length took pity on the situation of the Christians, offered them an opportunity of repairing their misfortunes. The menaces of Saladin and the sight of the ravages he was committing exasperated the Christian soldiers. Baldwin led forth his army from Ascalon, and surprised the Mussulmans in the very same plains whereon Godfrey and the leaders of the First Crusade gained their celebrated victory over the Egyptians. Saladin could not resist the impetuosity of their attack, and lost the battle after having defended himself valiantly in the midst of his Mamelukes, a new military force which he had himself formed, and by which he was always surrounded in time of danger. Saladin saw all his army perish in this disastrous battle, which was never effaced from his memory, and which, as he said in a letter, made the star of the family of Aoud to pale. Mounted on a camel, and followed by a few officers, Saladin experienced the greatest dangers in his flight across the desert, and returned almost alone to Egypt, whence he had so recently set out at the head of a formidable army. And yet the Christians did not reap much advantage from their victory. They laid siege in vain to the cities of Emesa and Haram, whilst Saladin soon got together fresh troops in Egypt, and returned to threaten the kingdom of Jerusalem. The victory of Ascalon eluded the Christians, and made them rush. Saladin, on the contrary, rendered more cautious by defeat, took advantage of every false step of his enemies, and ambuscades, employed all the stratagems of war, and several times surprised and beat them on the banks of the Jordan, and in the vicinity of Panias. Baldwin, who was very near falling into the hands of the Saracens, collected all the forces that were left in his dominions. But he could obtain no advantage over Saladin, and was obliged to sue for peace, which the state of his kingdom and his own infirmities rendered every day more necessary. The leprosy by which he was attacked made alarming progress. He lost his sight, and was no longer able to undertake the cares of government. As he mistrusted most of the barons and leading men of his kingdom, he offered the government to Philip, Count of Flanders, who was come into Asia to combat the infidels. But Philip preferred making war upon the Mussulmans to governing the Christians of Palestine. The Count of Tripoli was pointed out by the opinion of both the people and the nobles as the only person capable of governing. But the suffrages of the people only augmented the suspicions of Baldwin, who had long dreaded the ambition of Raymond. Obliged to abandon a throne, the weak monarch trembled at the idea of placing on it a man who might soon make him forgotten. And he chose in preference a knight without name or glory, whose only title arose from his having espoused Sibylla, daughter of King Amaury, and widow of the Marquis of Montferrat, surnamed Longsword. Guy of Lusignan did not justify the choice of Baldwin by his conduct, and disgusted everyone by the excess of his pride. In this state of things, the interests of the Christian colonies required that the truce made with the Mussulmans should be strictly observed. But such was then the destiny of the kingdom of Jerusalem, that nobody had sufficient power or ascendancy to maintain peace, whilst the meanest of the barons or knights could, at his will, provoke war. The rashness and imprudence of one man again brought down upon Palestine the whole force of Saladin. Old chronicles have related the romantic adventures and extraordinary fortune of Renaud de Chatillon. Born at Chatillon-sur-Indre, of obscure parents, he followed the army of Louis the Young into Asia, and enrolled himself in the troops of Raymond de Poitiers, Prince of Antioch. Raymond having lost his life in battle, his widow Constance was solicited to select a new husband, who might be associated with her in the government. This princess passed by the most illustrious nobles and knights, for she had remarked the personal beauty and chivalric bravery of Renaud de Chatillon, and would accept of no other husband. By this marriage, which, according to William of Tyre, filled the Christian barons with surprise, she all at once raised a young obscure man to the throne of Antioch. Although Reno the Chatillon had obtained the love of Constance, he could not conciliate the confidence and esteem of his new subjects. A formidable party was formed against him, at the head of which was the Patriarch Amaury. Reno, full of vexation and anger, cast into prison all who were opposed to him. By his orders the Patriarch was led to the top of one of the towers of the citadel, and, with his bare head, rubbed with honey, left, in the heat of summer, during a whole day, exposed to flies and insects. 299. Reno the Chatillon, after having filled the city of Ascalon with terror and mourning, was desirous of signalizing his reign by some warlike enterprise. Became the leader of an army in which he had been a soldier, he began by making war against the Emperor of Constantinople, and armed several vessels, with which he ravaged the isle of Cyprus. The Greek emperor hastened to avenge the insult, and was soon with an army encamped within sight of Ascalon. Reno, not being master of a sufficient force with which to defend himself, had recourse to baseness to disarm the anger of his enemy, and came, with a cord round his neck, and torn vestments, to lay his sword at the feet of the emperor, who granted him peace. When the Greeks had resumed their way to Constantinople, Reno turned his arms against the Saracens. He at once put to flight the army of Nureddin, who had advanced towards the territory of Antioch.
Doesn't look like it.
But, led away by thirst for booty, he fell into an ambuscade, was made prisoner and conducted to Aleppo, where the Mussulmans detained him many years. At last some of his ancient companions succeeded in breaking his chains, and what is not unworthy of remark, the produce of the booty made in an incursion on the territories of Damascus was the price of his liberty. When Reno the Chatillon issued from his captivity, his wife Constance was no longer living, and the son of Raymond arrived at the age of maturity, governing the Principality of Antioch. Reno repaired to Jerusalem, where the remembrance of his exploits and misfortunes, suffered in the cause of the Christians, secured him a welcome from the king and the barons. Having, in his second marriage, espoused the widow of Humphrey de Thuru, he became lord of Carrick, and some castles, situated on the confines of Arabia and Palestine. Reno led into these cities and fortresses a great number of Templars, whom he associated with his fortunes. He had just established himself there, and had already begun to ravage the frontiers of Arabia, when the truce was concluded with Saladin. Nothing could induce Reno de Chatillon to lay down his arms. Every day he made fresh forays in the neighborhood of Carrick, and plundered the caravans of the Mussulman pilgrims on their way to Mecca. Heedless of the rights of nations or humanity, he imprisoned women and children, and massacred unarmed men. Saladin complained to Baldwin of these infractions of treaties, but it was not in the power of the king of Jerusalem to give him the satisfaction he demanded. The Sultan, irritated by the conduct of the Franks, seized 1,500 pilgrims who were cast upon the shores of Egypt by a tempest, and threatened to detain them unless the Mussulman prisoners were promptly set at liberty. Neither the demands of Saladin, nor the prayers of Baldwin, nor even the fate of the Christian captives, had the least effect upon Reno de Chatillon and the Templars, so long accustomed to sport with all treaties made with the Mussulmans. Thereupon Saladin again determined upon war, and set out a third time, from the banks of the Nile, to enter Palestine at the head of an army. At the approach of danger, the Christians united their efforts to stop the progress of the Saracens. An assembly, formed of all classes of citizens, ordered a general contribution to be levied, the produce of which was employed in repairing the fortifications of the castles and cities, whilst all the barons and knights flew to arms. But the time was not yet come in which Saladin should invade the kingdom of Jerusalem. In each of his expeditions he appeared to try the strength of the Christians, and when he met with strong resistance, waited patiently for a more favorable moment. After having ravaged Galilee by his lieutenants and commenced the siege of Peru, he suddenly drew off his forces to go and make war upon the Atabeques, who were masters of Mosul and several cities of Mesopotamia. The Christians took no other advantage of his absence than to renew their incursions upon the territory of Damascus. Renaud de Chatillon made several expeditions to the shores of the Red Sea, and even conceived the daring project of going to the cities of Mecca and Medina, in plundering the Kaaba and the tomb of the Prophet. A troop of intrepid warriors set forward on the march under his orders. They surprised the Egyptian merchants who were bearing back the treasures of India, far away of the Red Sea, and, preceded by terror, advanced in triumph into a country which had never before seen the Christians. Renaud and his companions had already reached the valley of Rabat, situated 10 leagues from Medina, when they were surprised and attacked by a Mussulman army, which had been hastily dispatched from Syria. After an obstinate and sanguinary combat, victory favored the Saracens. Renaud escaped the pursuit of the conquerors as if by a miracle, and returned with a small number of his troops to the castle of Carrick. Some of the prisoners were led into Egypt, where the sentence of the Qadis condemned them to the death of the lowest criminals. Others were conveyed to Mecca, where their blood was shed without the victims immolated at the ceremony of the Great Bairam. 300. These horrible executions did not satisfy the vengeance of Saladin. When he heard of the expedition of the Christians, which he considered a frightful sacrilege, his anger knew no bounds, and he swore upon the Quran to revenge the insult offered to the Mussulman religion. The Sultan, whom the Christians already styled the Scourge of God, re-entered Galilee with sword and flame, and advanced towards the castle of Carrick, constantly repeating the oath he had taken of slaying Renaud with his own hand. The Mussulmans would have rendered themselves masters of the castle, but for the bravery of one knight, who alone maintained the drawbridge, and by a glorious death deprived Saladin of this conquest. A Christian army was soon upon the march to repel this attack of the Saracens. Saladin, despairing for the present of wreaking his revenge upon Renaud, laid waste the lands on the banks of the Jordan, in the very face of the Christian army, which did not dare to attack him. After having several times renewed his attempts upon the fortress of Carrick, and given up to the flames Naples, Sebosto, and several other cities, he at length consented to a truce, and led back his army into Mesopotamia. Saladin availed himself of the peace made with the Christians, to dissipate the troubles which had arisen in his states, and to pursue his conquests in Syria. At each truce he got possession of a city or a province. He extended his dominions, and thus placed under his control countries which became so many the more enemies for the Christians. The Franks, on the contrary, when war was suspended, gave themselves madly up to their internal divisions. Peace with them gave birth to 1,000 new factions, and the kingdom then found in its own bosom enemies much more dangerous than those against whom they had been at war. The knights and barons, on their return to Jerusalem, accused Gaida Lusignan of having neglected the opportunity for conquering Saladin, and reproached him with having permitted the ravages exercised by the Mussulmans in the richest provinces of Palestine. Baldwin, who had yielded up the royal authority with a great regret, listened to the complaints of the barons, and hastened to reascend the tottering throne. He undertook to dissolve the marriage with Sibylla, and cited Guy de Lusignan before the Patriarch of Jerusalem and the nobles of the kingdom, in order to deprive him of the counties of Ascalon and Jaffa. As Guy did not appear on the day named, Baldwin, although infirm and blind, repaired to Antioch, and finding the gates shut, struck them several times with his hand without causing them to be opened. 301. This unfortunate prince called upon heaven to witness this insult, and returned to Jerusalem, swearing to revenge himself upon Guy de Lusignan. On his side, Guy no longer observed any measures, but took up arms to sustain his revolt. In this emergency, Baldwin could find no better means of punishing Guy than to oppose to him a regent and a new king. By his orders, Baldwin V, who was 5 years of age, and born of the first marriage of Sibylla with the son of the Marquis de Montferrat, was crowned in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, in the presence of the nobles and the clergy. Raymond, Count of Tripoli, less odious to Baldwin than Guy, obtained the regency and assumed the reins of government. The kingdom of Jerusalem, which had proceeded rapidly to decay since the reign of Baldwin III, became now an object worthy of pity. The stormy passions, almost always inseparable from a feudal government, had long since weakened all the springs of authority. The royalty, for whose remains they were quarreling, was nothing but a vain name. In the midst of the factions by which he was surrounded, a king of Jerusalem could neither revenge his own injuries, nor those of the Church or of Christ. Want of courage was the only crime he could punish, without exciting the murmurs of the barons, because with them cowards found no defenders. Amaury had ignominiously hanged 12 Templars, accused of having neglected the defense of the fortress. But he had not the power to receive an ambassador sent by the old man of the mountain, in whom the hope of freeing himself from a tribute paid to the Grand Master of the Templars had awakened a desire to become a Christian. When the ambassador was assassinated in Jerusalem by a Templar, Amaury had no authority to bring the murderer to judgment. Deplorable weakness of a king who possesses not the first prerogative of royalty, that of maintaining justice and causing the rights of nations to be respected. The kingdom was covered with strong castles, the commanders of which barely recognized the authority of the king. On the summit of every mountain upon which appeared threatening towers, in caverns even, which had been transformed into fortresses, barons commanded as masters, and made peace or war at their pleasure. The military orders, the only, supported the state, or divided among themselves, and sometimes shed their blood in quarrels fatal to the cause of the Christians. Discord reigned between the clergy and the Knights of the Temple and St. John. The military orders were not subject to the jurisdiction of ecclesiastics, and the clergy, accustomed to dictate laws to princes, but not endure the haughty independence of a few warriors. Led away by the spirit of discord, the Hospitallers raised edifices in front of the Church of the Resurrection, and often drowned the voices of the priests who celebrated the praises of God at the foot of his altars. Some of them even went so far as to pursue priests with arrow shots into the very Church of the Holy Sepulchre. As the only vengeance, the priests gathered together in bundles the arrows that had been shot at them, and placed them on an elevated spot on the Mount of Olives, that everyone might be acquainted with the sacrilege. These quarrels, which were every day renewed, were carried before the tribunal of the Holy See, whose decisions frequently only inflamed the minds of the disputants the more. The Church of Rome, very far from restoring peace to the Christians of the East, often cast amongst them fresh coals of discord. The schisms which troubled the West more than once kindled war in the holy places, even upon the tomb of Christ. Concord seldom prevailed long between the inhabitants of Palestine and the European warriors who came into Asia to combat the infidels. The Syrian barons employed the forces of their auxiliaries to carry out their own ambitious views, and the latter, by their pride and disdain, laid a high price upon their services. Almost always on the arrival of fresh pilgrims, a treaty was violated or a truce broken, in order to make incursions upon the territories of the Saracens. And not unfrequently, the Crusaders, without even seeing the enemy, abandoned Palestine to the perils of a war they had themselves provoked. In the cities, particularly the maritime cities, several nations dwelled together and disputed precedence and sovereignty, sword in hand. All who came to establish themselves in the Holy Land brought with them and preserved the remembrances and prejudices of their native country. In the cities of Ascalon, Tyre, or Ptolemy, the inhabitants were much more interested in the glory and prosperity of Pisa, Genoa, and Venice than in the safety of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The greater part of the barons and knights displayed none of the heroic resignation of the early soldiers of the cross in supporting fatigues of braving difficulties. Since the conquest of Egypt had been contemplated, war was only considered as a means of acquiring wealth. And the thirst for booty destroyed the principle of honor, the love of glory, and even all anxiety for the cause of Christ. The question was no longer what enemy was to be attacked, what ally was to be defended, but what city or province was to be delivered up to pillage. Discipline degenerated in the camp. The Christian warriors still displayed their natural bravery, but they neither knew how to obey nor to command, and anarchy reigned as completely in the army as throughout the kingdom. Many of the leaders abandoned their colors under the most perilous circumstances, and severe inaction or their neutrality. Some, like the Templar Messier and his companions, forgetful of their vows, ravaged the Christian provinces, whilst others, urged on by ambition or vengeance, allied themselves with the Saracens, and received in the service of the infidels the reward of their disgraceful apostasy. Religion, which ought to have been the connecting tie between the Christians established in the Holy Land, and which alone could preserve, among them sentiments of patriotism, religion had lost all empire over their minds. War was still made in its name, but its laws were unpracticed and unacknowledged. The conversion of the Maronites of Libanus, who rejoined the Church of Rome in the reign of Baldwin IV, was celebrated at Jerusalem as a victory gained over heresy, but it had not the effect of bringing back the Christians to the spirit of the Scriptures. Pious men who lived in a corrupted age groaned under the depravity of manners which every day made such frightful progress. 302. The respectable Archbishop of Tyre trembles as he traces the history of this unhappy period, and fears lest truth should give to his recitals the color of satire. There is, says he, scarcely one chaste woman to be found in the city of Jerusalem. The leaders of the Christian colonies, equally with the heads of the church, themselves set the example of licentiousness. The Christians beheld the Queen of Jerusalem, the widow of Baldwin III, keep up a criminal intercourse with Andronicus, and seek an abode among the Saracens with the companion of her debaucheries. 303. Bohemond, Prince of Antioch, repudiated his wife, Irena, to espouse a courtesan. The Patriarch, disgusted with such a scandal, excommunicated young Bohemond, and placed an interdict upon his states. And thus the guilty amours of the Christian prince produced trouble and desolation throughout a whole nation. The sight even of the tomb of Christ was unable to inspire more holy thoughts. The Patriarch Heraclius, who only owed his elevation to mundane and profane qualities, lavished the treasures due to pilgrims and the poor upon infamous prostitutes, and the Christian people were often astonished to see the notorious Pacta Reverie display, even in the sanctuary, ornament purchased with the alms of the faithful. A people thus degenerated could not possibly preserve the kingdom of Christ. The eyes of all were turned towards the west, and Heraclius, attended by the two Grand Masters of the Temple and St. John, was sent into Europe to solicit the prompt assistance of kings and their warriors. The King of France, Philip Augustus, received the Christian deputies with great honors. But as he had but recently ascended the throne, the interests of his kingdom would not permit him to go in person to the defense of Jerusalem. Henry II, King of England, appeared to be the last hope of the Christians. He had promised the Pope to make the pilgrimage to the Holy Land as an expiation of the murder of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Heraclius repaired to his court, presenting him with the keys and standard of the Holy Sepulchre, and pressing him to perform his promise. The bad reputation of the Patriarch had preceded him into Europe, and very much weakened the effect of his words. He displayed, likewise, neither the meekness nor the charity of the Scriptures, and only irritated those whom he sought to persuade or convince. As the English monarch hesitated to fulfill his promises, alleging his advanced age and the welfare of his dominions, Heraclius loaded him with the most outrageous reproaches, threatening him with the anger of heaven. The aged Henry, appearing irritated by this language, the Patriarch redoubled his insolence and pride. "You may," said he, on terminating his discourse, "treat me as you treated my brother Thomas, for it is quite indifferent to me whether I die in Syria by the hands of infidels, or perish here by the orders of you, who are more wicked than the Saracens." Henry endeavored to conceal his anger, and did not dare to punish the envoy of the Christians. He even treated him with great magnificence, but yet did not leave England. He contented himself with sending the Christians of Jerusalem a large sum of money, and exhorting his subjects to arm themselves for the defense of the Holy Land. The zeal for crusades began at this time to abate, and several ambassadors returned to Jerusalem without having been able to arouse the enthusiasm of the Western Christians. nations, to be excited to active ardor for holy wars, required the example of princes or kings. The warriors of Europe paid little attention to the exhortations of the Pope and Heraclius. The deputies returned into Palestine without having obtained the assistance they demanded, and their appearance produced discouragement and despair among all the Christians of the East. The unfortunate king, Baldwin, had entirely lost the faculties of both mind and body, and, tormented by his sufferings, he every day drew nearer to the tomb, presenting but too faithful an image of the weakness and decline of his kingdom. Whilst the approach of death filled his palace with mourning, parties contended for a throne which tottered to its fall, and for a crown which the most wise compared to the crown of thorns of Christ. When he closed his eyes, the evils increased, and discord submitted to no restraint. The Count of Tripoli wished to retain the reins of government as regent, whilst Sibylla was desirous of bestowing the scepter upon her husband. In the midst of these dissensions, Baldwin V, the weak and fragile hope of the kingdom, died suddenly. All who had aspired to his authority were accused of his death, unhappy period in which such accusations could possibly be well founded, and in which a whole people could think of reproaching a queen with the murder of her own son. Scarcely was Baldwin dead than his mother desired to reign in his place, and in order to satisfy the ambition of herself and Guy de Lusignan, she disdained no artifice and spared no perfidious promises. Whilst the Count of Tripoli was gathering together at Naples the barons and principal men of the kingdom, the daughter of Amaury, by the advice of the Patriarch and the Grand Master of the Templars, announced her intention of separating herself from her husband, and choosing a warrior able to defend the kingdom. When this report had circulated through Jerusalem, Sibylla ordered the gates of the city to be shut, and repaired to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In the presence of the tomb of Christ, Heraclius took the oath of allegiance to her in the name of the clergy and the people, pronounced her divorce with a loud voice, and commanded her in the name of heaven to bestow her hand and scepter upon him she deemed most worthy of them. At these words Sibylla placed the crown upon the head of her husband, who was on his knees before her, saying it was not in the power of man to separate those whom God had united. Whilst a part of the people and some of the barons, seduced by vain promises, applauded the choice of Sibylla, the partisans of Raymond were highly indignant at having been deceived by a woman. The coronation of Guy de Lusignan naturally alarmed all who thought that Jerusalem stood in less need of a king than of a defender. Baldwin of Ramla, one of the most skillful captains of his times, despaired of the safety of the kingdom, and retired into the principality of Antioch, repeating the threats of the prophets against Jerusalem. Geoffrey de Lusignan, when he heard of the elevation of his brother, could not forbear exclaiming, "Well, if they have made a king of him, they would have made a god of me if they had known me." When that which had taken place at Jerusalem was announced to the barons assembled at Naples, most of them resolved to abandon Palestine. But the Count of Tripoli detained them, advising them to name a new king, and bestow the crown upon Humphrey III, who had recently married Isabella, the second daughter of Amaury. He even promised to gain the support of Saladin for this election, and succeeded in persuading the assembly. Whilst they were yet deliberating, young Humphrey, terrified at the burden they wished to impose upon him, fled away secretly by night, and hastened to the capital to ask pardon of Queen Sibylla, protesting that he preferred ease and life to the throne of Jerusalem. This flight disconcerted all measures and changed all projects. Several barons, not knowing to what party it would be best to ally themselves, went and took the oath to Guy de Lusignan, whilst others, returning to their castles, awaited coming events. Raymond retired to his county of Tiberias, of which he had obtained the sovereignty. The retreat and the murmurs of the enemies of God only increased his pride. The more he stood in need of mildness and moderation, the more hotness and severity he displayed. His disdainful manners drove from him the barons who had remained faithful to him. Stimulated by the Grand Master of the Templars, who was the declared enemy of the Count of Tripoli, he made preparations to besiege the city of Tiberias. whilst Raymond, who was determined to defend himself, carried away by the excess of his anger, implored the aid of Saladin against the king of Jerusalem. At the approach of the evils about to fall upon the kingdom, nothing was heard but complaints and seditious clamors. But neither the dangers of the Christian colonies, nor the aspect of the threatened holy places, could silence ambition or check revolt. The historian of the Kingdom of Jerusalem here feels the pen fall from his hand, and stops, terrified at the events which are left for him to describe. Amidst the general disorder and agitation, the superstitious minds of the Christians beheld nothing in the future but great calamities, and everything seemed to present sinister presages to their eyes. The signs which were displayed in the heavens, says a contemporary chronicle, allowed it to be plainly perceived that God held in abomination that which was going on. Impetuous winds, tempests, and storms arose on all sides. The light of the sun was obscured during several days, and hailstones as large as the eggs of a goose fell from heaven. The earth, equally agitated by frequent and horrible earthquakes, gave notice of coming ruin and destruction, with disasters and defeats in war which were soon to visit the kingdom. Neither could the sea confine itself within its bounds and limits, but announced to us, by its horrible floods or its unusually impetuous waves, the anger of God ready to fall upon us. Fire was seen blazing in the air, like a house in flames. You would have sworn that all the elements and architecture of God were angry, and abhor the excesses, wickednesses, dissoluteness, and offenses of the human race. Such were the presages that struck the greater number of the Christians. But thinking men could perceive much more certain signs of the approaching fall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Mosul, Aleppo, and all the Muslim cities of Syria and Mesopotamia had submitted to the power of Saladin. The son of Aelp had triumphed over the emirs and the scattered family of Nuruddin. All the treasures of Egypt, all the forces of Asia, were in his hands. There remained only one conquest for him to make, and fortune, which had leveled all obstacles before him, soon furnished him with a pretext and an opportunity of giving the last blow to the power of the Christians. The truce made with the king of Jerusalem was broken at the same time by both Christians and Mussulmans. Renaud Chatillon continued his incursions upon the territories of the infidels, and only replied to the complaints of Saladin by new violations of treaties. A Mussulman army, which the Sultan of Damascus had sent to the assistance of the Count of Tripoli, advanced into the country of Galilee, whither 500 knights of the Temple and St. John hastened to defend the Christian territory and give battle to the Saracens. They were speedily overwhelmed by numbers, and almost all perished on the field of battle. Old chronicles, whilst celebrating the bravery of the Christian knights, relate prodigies which we have now great difficulty in believing. These indomitable heroes, after having exhausted their arrows, plucked from their own bodies such as had pierced them, and launched them back upon the enemy. Pressed by fatigue and heat, they drank their own blood, and revived their strength by the very means which must weaken it. At length, after having broken their lances and swords, they rushed upon their enemies, fought body to body, rolling in the dust with the Mussulman warriors, and died threatening their conquerors. Above all the rest, nothing could equal the heroic valor of Jacques de Maille, a knight of the Temple. Mounted on a white horse, he remained alone in the field of battle, and fought on, surrounded by heaps of slain. Although hemmed in on all sides, he refused to surrender. The horse which he rode, worn out with fatigue and exhausted by wounds, sunk under him and dragged him with him. But the intrepid knight arose, lance in hand, covered with blood and dust, and bristling with arrows, and rushed upon the ranks of the Mussulmans, astonished at his audacity. At length he fell, covered with wounds, but fighting to the last. The Saracens took him for St. George, whom the Christians believed they saw descend from heaven to join their battalions.
Ouch.
After his death, the Turkish soldiers, whom an historian calls the children of Babylon and Sodom, drew near with signs of respect to his body, slain by 1,000 wounds. They wiped off the blood, they shared the rags of his clothes and the fragments of his arms, and, in their brutal excitement, evince their admiration by actions that make modesty blush when speaking of them. 304. The Grand Master of the Templars, with 2 of his knights, were all that escaped from the carnage. This battle was fought on the 1st of May, 1187. In the season, says an ancient chronicle, in which flowers and roses are gathered in the fields, the Christians of Nazareth found nothing but the traces of slaughter and the mangled bodies of their brethren. They buried them in the church of St. Mary, repeating these prophetic words, "Daughters of Galilee, put on your garments of mourning. And you, daughters of Shin, weep over the ill that threatened the kings of Judah." The terror which this sanguinary defeat created for a moment appeased the discords of the Christians. The king consented to be reconciled to the Count of Tripoli, whilst on his part, Raymond resolved to forget his private injuries, and to use every effort to repair the misfortunes he had brought upon the kingdom. He repaired to Jerusalem, where Guy de Lusignan, coming forth to meet him, received him with marks of sincere affection. The 2 princes embraced before the people and swore to fight in unison for the heritage of Christ. After the rupture of the truce, Saladin employed himself in getting together a formidable army. Turks, Arabs, Kurds, and Egyptians flocked to his standard. He promised the spoils of the Christians to the Mussulman families that had been driven from Palestine. He distributed cities and provinces beforehand to his faithful emirs, and held out to all his soldiers the certainty of pillage or glorious martyrdom. The Caliph of Baghdad and all the imams of Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia put up prayers for the triumph of his arms and the deliverance of Jerusalem. He crossed the Jordan and advanced into Galilee at the head of 80,000 horse. In a council held at Jerusalem, Guy de Lusignan, the Count of Tripoli, and the barons deliberated upon the measures most proper to be adopted to save the kingdom. The knights of the 3 military orders, the troops of the king and the nobles, the garrisons of cities, with all Christians able to bear arms, received orders to assemble on the plain of Sifuri. It was determined to employ in the prosecution of the war the treasures sent by Henry II, which were kept in the house of the Temple, and to associate the English monarch in the glory of this holy expedition. The arms of England were represented on the standards of the Christian army. The wood of the true cross, which had so often animated the Crusaders in fight, was exhibited to the people as a last means of safety, and carried in triumph to the place where the defenders of Jerusalem were assembled. An army of 50,000 fighting men had been collected on the plain of Sifuri, when the leaders learned that Saladin had carried the city of Tiberias by assault, and threatened the citadel, in which were shut up the women and children of the Count of Tripoli. The Christians, who had escaped from the sword of the Saracens, in the utmost terror, took refuge in the camp of Sifuri, conjuring the king and the chiefs to put an end to the ravages of the infidels. The barons assembled in the tent of Guy, and all at once exclaimed that it was necessary to march immediately against the enemy. Raymond then arose and demanded permission to speak. "I am about," said he, "to lay before you advice, which will surprise you. But I offer it with the greater confidence, from its being opposed to my personal interests. My desolated country, my cities in ashes, my subjects ready to submit to death or slavery, my wife exposed to the insults of the Mussulmans, all implore instant succor from me and you. But it is my duty to think of the safety of the Christian cities now left without garrisons. In this army assembled on the plain of Sifuri exists the only hope which the Christians of the East have left. You behold here all the soldiers of Christ, all the defenders of Jerusalem. If they perish, the infidels have no other foes to dread. Beware, then, of leading this multitude of men and horses into a dry and arid country, where the season, with thirst and hunger, must soon deliver them up without defense to the enemy. The number even of the Christian soldiers inspires me with more alarm than confidence. They present nothing but a confused troop of men got together in haste, and totally unable to support fatigue. The Mussulman archers are more skillful than our soldiers in casting javelins, and may harass us on our march, without our being able to defend ourselves. the cavalry of Saladin is more numerous and better trained than ours, and may attack us with advantage on the plains, across which we must pass. Abandon, then, I entreat you, Tiberius, to the Mussulmans, and let us save an army which may yet repair our losses. I swore before God and before man, that I would willingly abandon the county of Tripoli, with all the lands I possess, to procure the safety of the city of Christ. Our only aim must be to destroy the power of Saladin, and at the same time to preserve some defenders for the kingdom of Jerusalem. If we go to meet the enemy and should be conquered, God himself will not be able to save the Christians, but will allow us to be delivered up to the infidels. If, on the contrary, the enemy come to offer themselves to our arms, all our losses will be repaired, and the evils that will fall upon me will become for me a source of gratification, since I shall have suffered for the cause of Christ and the safety of his people. The more generosity there was in this advice, the less sincere it was esteemed. The Grand Master of the Templars, blinded by his hatred for Raymond, interrupted him several times. He reminded the assembly of the alliance of the Count of Tripoli with Saladin, and explained aloud that he could plainly perceive the wolf's skin under the fleece of the sheep. When Raymond invoked the name of Christ, the Grand Master repeated with bitterness that the name of Muhammad was better fitted to the mouth of a traitor. The Count of Tripoli made not the least reply to the insulting words of the Grand Master, but finished his speech by these words, uttered with an accent of perfect conviction: I will submit to the punishment of death if these things do not fall out as I have said. The Council of the Knights and Barons adopted the opinion of Raymond. But one guy was left alone in his tent. The Grand Master came to him, and infused into his mind the blackest suspicions of the conduct and secret designs of the Count of Tripoli. The feeble Lusignan, who had already issued several contradictory orders, gave the command for marching to meet the enemy. For the first time, the King of Jerusalem was obeyed, and that was for the ruin of the Christians. The undetermined conduct that Lusignan had exhibited communicated itself to the other chiefs, and this want of a fixed purpose spread trouble and confusion throughout the army. The disheartened soldiers quitted the camp of Sufuri with reluctance, and saw nothing around them but presages of an approaching defeat. The Christian army advanced towards Tiberias, and were marching in silence across a plain, which modern travelers call the plain of Batu, when they perceived the standards of Saladin. The Mussulman army was encamped on the heights of Luabi, with the Lake of Tiberias in its rear. It covered the tops of the hills, and commanded all the defiles through which the Christians had to pass. The barons and knights then remembered the advice of Raymond, but they had lost the opportunity of following it, and the courage of the Christian soldiers alone could repair the errors of their leaders. The bold and desperate resolution was formed of cutting themselves a passage through the army of the enemy, so as to gain the banks of the Jordan. On the 4th of July, at break of day, the Christians began their march. From the moment they were in motion, the Mussulman archers unceasingly poured upon them showers of arrows. The army of the Franks was bravely enduring, on its march, the attacks of the Saracen archers, when Saladin descended into the plain at the head of his cavalry. Then the Christians were compelled to stop and fight with the enemy that disputed their passage. 305, the first shock was impetuous and terrible. But as the Franks had for many days been short of both provisions and water, and were oppressed by heat and thirst, they had less strength and courage, and fell more from lassitude than in consequence of their wounds. The bishops passed through the ranks, and endeavored to revive the ardor of the soldiers by the images of religion. The true cross, placed upon an elevated spot, for a moment reanimated them, and drew around it the most fervent and the most intrepid. Saladin himself said, in a letter, that the Christian soldiers fought around the cross with the greatest bravery, and that they seemed to consider it the strongest tie that bound them together, and as their impenetrable buckler. 306, but the sight of a revered sign, and the passing ardor which it created, only served to increase the disorder of the fight. All the Mussulman forces united in one body to attack the Christians. the cavalry of Saladin poured down upon them several times, with irresistible impetuosity, and penetrated through their ranks. Victory was evidently about to incline to the side of the Saracens, when night put an end to the conflict. The Franks and the Saracens both remained on the plain where they had fought all day, and prepared to renew the battle on the morrow. The Saracens were confident of victory. Saladin went through the ranks of his army, inflaming the courage of the Muslim soldiers by his presence and his speeches. "Tomorrow," said he, "is a festival for the true believers, for it is on Friday that Muslims offer up their prayers, and that Muhammad listens to the vows that are made to him." The Muslims replied to their leader by the loudest acclamations. Saladin then placed archers on the heights, ordered 400 charges of arrows to be distributed, and disposed his troops in such a manner that the Christian army should be surrounded from the very commencement of the contest. The Christian soldiers took advantage of the darkness to rally and close in their ranks. But their powers were exhausted. Sometimes they exhorted each other to brave death, and at others, raising their hands towards heaven, implored the All-Powerful to save them. They then uttered threats against the Saracens, who were near enough to hear them. But bad and sinister presentiments appeared to deprive them of all hopes of victory. In order to conceal their alarms, they made their camp resound during the whole night with the noise of drums and trumpets. At last daylight appeared, and was the signal for the entire ruin of the Christian army. As soon as the Franks beheld the whole of the forces of Saladin, and found themselves surrounded on all sides, they were seized with surprise and terror. The two armies remained for a considerable time drawn up inside of each other, Saladin waiting until the sun had completely illumined the horizon to give the signal for attack. From dawn a strong wind had prevailed, which blew full in the faces of the Christians, and covered them with clouds of dust. When Saladin gave the fatal word, the Saracens rushed upon their enemies from all sides, uttering the most terrifying cries. To employ the expressions of Oriental writers, it was then that the sons of Paradise and the children of fire fought out their terrible quarrel. The arrows sounded in the air like the noisy flight of birds. The water of swords sank, the blood of arrows spouted out from the bosom of the melee, and covered the earth like the waters of rain. 307, the Christians at first defended themselves valiantly, but Saladin, having set fire to the dry grass that covered the plain, the flames surrounded their army, and scorched the feet of both men and horses. Disorder began to prevail in their ranks, but they fought bravely, still. Swords gleamed through the flames, and the Christian knights, rushing from masses of smoke and fire, precipitated themselves, lance in hand, upon their enemies. In their despair, they endeavored to pierce through the battalions of the Saracens, but everywhere met with an invincible resistance. Again and again they returned to the charge, and as often were they repulsed. A prey to hunger and a consuming thirst, they saw nothing around them but burning rocks and the sparkling swords of their enemies. The mountain of Adana rose on their left, and in it they endeavored to find an asylum. But, hotly pursued by the Saracens, they were cast, some down precipices, and others into narrow ravines, where their bravery was of no avail. The Knights of the Temple and St. John performed prodigies of valor, and fought until the close of day, rallying round the wood of the True Cross. This sacred standard was borne by the Bishop of Ptolemy, who was killed in the heat of the battle. The Bishop of Lydda, who took it up and endeavored to fly, was stopped and taken prisoner. A cry of despair arose from among the Franks when they saw the sign of their safety in the hands of the conqueror. Even the most brave cast away their arms, and without attempting to fly, rushed upon the swords of the infidels. The field of battle became nothing but a scene of desolation, and the Christian warriors who had not been able to save the cross of Christ no longer feared either death or slavery. The King of Jerusalem was made prisoner with his brother Geoffrey, the Grand Master of the Templars, renowned as Chatillon, and all the most illustrious knights of Palestine men, who commanded the vanguard of the Christian army, after having fought valiantly, opened for himself a passage through the Saracens, and fled to Tripoli, 308, where, a short time afterwards, he died of despair, accused by the Muslims of having violated treaties, and by the Christians of having betrayed both his religion and his country. Bohemond, Prince of Antioch, Reno of Sidon, the young Count of Tiberias, and a small number of soldiers accompanied Raymond in his flight, and were the only persons that escaped after this day, so fatal to the kingdom of Jerusalem.
There it is.
The Oriental historians, whilst describing the victory of the Saracens, have celebrated the bravery and firmness of the Frank knights, covered with their cuirasses, made with rings of steel. These brave warriors at first presented an impenetrable wall to the strokes of the Saracens. But when their horses sunk, exhausted by fatigue, or wounded by lances, or javelins, Saladin met with very little more resistance, and the battle became a horrible carnage. An Arabian author, a secretary and companion of Saladin, who was present at this terrible conflict, has not been able to refrain from pitying the disasters of the vanquished. I saw, says he, the hills, the plains, the valleys covered with their dead bodies.
No fragment guns. No.
I saw their colors abandoned and soiled with blood and dust. I saw their heads struck off, their members dispersed, and their carcasses piled up like stones. After the battle, the cords of the tents were not sufficient to bind the prisoners. The Saracen soldiers drove them in crowds, like vile herds of cattle. The conquerors divided the captives amongst them, and the number was so great that, according to an historian, a pair of shoes was exchanged for a Christian knight. Saladin caused a tent to be erected in his camp, in which he received Guy de Lusignan and the principal leaders of the Christian army, whom victory had placed in his hands. He treated the king of the Franks with kindness, and ordered him to be served with a drink cold in snow.
Guns, yeah, man.
As the king, after having drunk, presented the cup to Reno de Chatillon, who was next to him, the Sultan stopped him, and said, "That traitor shall not drink in my presence, for I will show him no favor." Then, addressing himself to Reno, he made him the most severe reproaches for his violation of treaties, and threatened him with death if he did not embrace the religion of the prophet he had insulted. Reno de Chatillon replied with noble firmness, and braved the menaces of Saladin, who struck him with a saber. Some Mussulman soldiers, at the signal of their master, threw themselves upon the disarmed prisoner, and the head of a martyr of the cross fell at the feet of the king of Jerusalem. On the following day the Sultan ordered the Knights of the Temple and St. John, who were among the prisoners, to be brought before him. And, as they were led past his throne, said, "I will deliver the earth of these two unclean races." The Grand Master of the Templars found favor before him, doubtless because his imprudent counsels had given up the Christian army to the swords of the Saracens. A great number of emirs and doctors of the law surrounded the throne of Saladin, and the Sultan permitted each of them to slay a Christian knight. Some of them refused to shed blood, and turned their eyes away from so odious a spectacle. But others, arming themselves with swords, massacred knights bound with fetters, without pity, whilst Saladin sat on his throne, applauding the horrible execution. The knights received the palm of martyrdom with joy. Most of the prisoners were anxious for death, and many among them, although not belonging to the military orders, cried aloud that they were Hospitallers or Templars, and, as if they feared they should want, executioners pressed before each other in order to secure the fatal stroke from the hands of the infidels. Saladin disgraced his victory by this barbarity. The fear with which the Christians inspired him, even after defeat, made him cruel. He became more humane and generous when he felt more assured of his victory and confident of his power. 2 days were devoted by the Mussulmans to returning thanks to heaven for the victory with which it had blessed their arms. And then Saladin gave his attention to all the advantages that might be attained from it. As soon as he became master of the citadel of Tiberias, he sent the wife of Raymond to Tripoli, and was, with his army, very shortly under the ramparts of Ptolemy. This city, full of merchants, and which, at a later period, sustained the attacks of the most powerful armies of the West during 3 years, did not stand out 2 days against Saladin. The inhabitants had liberty to retire with their most valuable property, and the churches were converted into mosques, in which thanks were offered up to Muhammad for the triumphs obtained over the Christian soldiers. The terror which preceded his army opened to Saladin the gates of Nablus, Jericho, Ramla, and a great number of other cities which were left almost without inhabitants. The cities of Caesarea, Arsa, Jaffa, and Beirut shared the fate of Ptolemy. The yellow standards of Saladin floated over their walls. On the seacoast, the cities of Tyre, Tripoli, and Ascalon still remained in the hands of the Christians. Saladin attacked Tyre without success, and determined to wait for a more favorable opportunity to renew the siege. Ascalon presented itself to him as a conquest of much greater importance, as it would assure his communication with Egypt. This city was besieged by the Mussulmans, but it resisted, at first, with more firmness than Saladin had expected.
Yeah, man,
when a breach was effected, the Sultan proposed peace. But the inhabitants, with whom despair supplied the place of courage, sent back his messengers without granting them a hearing.
I am not ashamed to say it.
Jerusalem, whom Saladin led with him in triumph, then entreated the defenders of Ascalon not to compromise the safety of their families and the Christians of the city by a useless defense. After this appeal, the principal among them came to the tent of the Sultan. It is not for ourselves, said they, that we are come to implore mercy, but for our wives and children. Of what importance in a perishable life to us? We look for a more solid blessing, and that death alone can procure us. God alone, the master of all events, has allowed you to obtain victories over the unhappy Christians. But you shall not enter into Ascalon unless you take pity on our families, and promise to restore the King of Jerusalem to liberty. Saladin, touched by the heroism of the inhabitants of Ascalon, accepted the conditions proposed. Such devotedness merited the redemption of a prince of nobler character and more worthy of the love of his subjects than Guy de Lusignan. Saladin consented to liberate the captive monarch at the expiration of a year. The moment was now come in which Jerusalem was again fated to fall into the power of the infidels. And all Mussulmans earnestly implored Muhammad for this crowning triumph for the arms of Saladin. After having taken Gaza and several fortresses in the neighborhood, the Sultan drew his army together and marched towards the holy city. A queen in tears, the children of the warriors slain at the battle of Tiberias, a few fugitive soldiers, and some pilgrims recently arrived from the west were the only guardians of the Holy Sepulchre. A great number of Christian families which had left the devastated provinces of Palestine filled the capital, and, very far from bringing it any assistance, only served to increase the general trouble and consternation. When Saladin drew near to the holy city, he caused the principal inhabitants to be sent for, and said to them, I acknowledge, as well as you, that Jerusalem is the house of God. I do not wish to profane its sanctity by the effusion of blood, abandon its walls, and I will bestow upon you a part of my treasures. I will give you as much land as you will be able to cultivate. We cannot, they replied, yield the city in which our God died. Still less can we give it up to you. Saladin, enraged by their refusal, swore upon the Quran to lay prostrate the towers and ramparts of Jerusalem, and to avenge the death of the Muslims slaughtered by the companions and soldiers of Godfrey of Bouillon. At the moment in which Saladin was speaking to the deputies, an eclipse of the sun all at once left the heavens in utter darkness, and appeared to be a presage fatal for the Christians. Nevertheless, the inhabitants, encouraged by the clergy, prepared to defend the city, and chose as their commander Volodyaboin, who had been present at the Battle of Tiberias. This old warrior, whose experience and virtues inspired confidence and respect, immediately set about repairing the fortifications and training the new defenders of Jerusalem. As he was deficient in officers, he created 50 knights from amongst the citizens. And all the Christians able to bear arms placed themselves under his command. and swore to shed their blood in the cause of Christ. They had no money to meet the expenses of the war, but all means of obtaining it seemed legitimate in a danger that threatened the city of God. They despoiled the churches, and the people, terrified at the approach of Saladin, beheld, without scandal, the precious metal, which covered the chapel of the Holy Sepulchre converted into coin. 309. The standards of Saladin were soon seen floating over the heights of Imaz, and the Mussulman army encamped on the same places on which Godfrey, Tancred, and the two Roberts had pitched their tents when they besieged the holy city. The besieged at first resisted boldly, and made frequent sorties, in which they bore in one hand a lance or a sword, and in the other a shovel filled with dust, which they cast upon the Saracens. A great number of Christians received the palm of martyrdom, and ascended, say the historians, to the heavenly Jerusalem. Many Mussulmans fell beneath the swords of their enemies, and went to dwell on the banks of the river which waters Paradise. Saladin, after being encamped for several days on the western side of the city, directed his operations towards the north, and caused the ramparts which extended from the gate of Jehoshaphat to that of St. Stephen to be undermined. The bravest of the citizens made a sortie, and endeavored to destroy the machines and works of the besiegers, encouraging each other by repeating these words of Scripture: "A single one of us shall make 10 infidels fly, and 10 of us shall put to flight 10,000. They performed prodigies of valor, but they could not interrupt the progress of the siege. Repulsed by the Saracens, they were forced to return to the city, whither their appearance brought terror and discouragement. The towers and ramparts appeared ready to fall at the first signal for a general assault. Despair then took entire possession of the inhabitants, who saw no means of defense within their power but tears and prayers. The soldiers crowded to the churches instead of flying to arms, and not even the promise of 100 pieces of gold could keep them on the tottering ramparts for one night. The clergy made procession through the streets to invoke the protection of heaven. Some struck their breasts with stones, whilst others tore their bodies with haircloth, crying aloud for mercy. Nothing was heard in Jerusalem but sobs and groans. But our Jesus Christ, says an old chronicle, would not hear them, for the luxury and impurity that were in the city would not allow either orisons or prayers to ascend before him. The despair of the inhabitants inspired them with the most contradictory projects at the same time. At one moment they formed the resolution of issuing in a body from the city, and seeking a glorious death in the ranks of the infidels. Whilst, the next, they placed their last hope in the clemency of Saladin. Amid the general trouble and agitation, the Greek and Syrian Christians, with the Melekite Christians, endured very unwillingly the authority of the Latins, and accused them of all the misfortunes of the war. A plot for giving up the city to the Mussulmans was discovered, which redoubled the general alarm, and made the principal inhabitants determine upon demanding a capitulation of Saladin. Accompanied by Volodya, they went and proposed to the Sultan to give up the place to him upon the conditions he had himself proposed before the siege. But Saladin remembered that he had sworn to take the city by assault, and put the inhabitants to the sword. And he sent back the deputies without giving them the least hope. Volodya returned several times, renewing his supplications and his prayers, but always found Saladin inexorable. One day, whilst the Christian deputies were earnestly imploring him to accept their capitulation, turning towards the place, and pointing to his standards which floated over the walls, "How can you ask me," said he, "to grant conditions to a city which is already taken?" Nevertheless, the Saracens were repulsed. And by the success the Christians had obtained, replied to the Sultan, "You see that Jerusalem is not without defenders.
Need some help, guys.
If we can obtain no mercy from you, we will form a terrible resolution, and the fruits of our despair shall fill you with terror. These temples and palaces that you are so anxious to conquer shall be totally destroyed. All the riches which excite the ambition and cupidity of the Saracens shall become the prey of the flames. We will destroy the Mosque of Omar. and the mysterious stone of Jacob, which is the object of your worship, shall be broken and pounded into dust. Jerusalem contains 5,000 Muslim prisoners. They shall all perish by the sword. We will, with our own hands, slay your wives and children, and thus spare them the shame of becoming your slaves. When the holy city shall be but a heap of ruins, one vast tomb, we will march out of it, followed by the angry manes of our friends and kindred. We will march out armed with sword and fire. And no one of us will ascend to paradise without having consigned 10 Mussulmans to hell. We shall thus obtain a glorious death, and shall die calling down upon your head the maledictions of the God of Jerusalem. This spirited speech alarmed Saladin, and he invited the deputies to come again on the following day. He consulted with the doctors of the law, who decided that he might accept the capitulation proposed by the besieged without violating his oath. The conditions were signed on the following day in the tent of the Sultan, and thus Jerusalem again fell into the power of the infidels after having been 88 years under the domination of the Christians. The Latin historians had remarked that the Crusaders entered the city on a Friday, and at the same hour that Christ had submitted to death to expiate the crimes of the human race. The Saracens retook the city on a Friday, the anniversary of the day on which, according to their creed, Muhammad set out from Jerusalem to ascend into heaven. This circumstance, which might influence Saladin in his agreement to sign the capitulation, did not fail to add a new splendor to his triumph with the Mussulmans, and caused him to be regarded as the favorite of the Prophet. All the warriors who were in Jerusalem when the capitulation was signed obtained permission to retire to Tyre or Tripoli. The conqueror granted life to the inhabitants, and allowed them to purchase their liberty. All Christians, with the exception of the Greeks and Syrians, received orders to quit Jerusalem at the expiration of 4 days. The rate of ransom was fixed at 10 pieces of gold for the men, 5 for the women, and 2 for the children. Such as could not purchase their liberty remained in slavery. These conditions had at first been received with joy by the Christians. But when they saw the day approach on which they were to leave Jerusalem, they experienced nothing but the most bitter grief at quitting the holy places. They watered the tomb of Christ with their tears, and regretted that they had not died to defend it. They visited Calvary and the churches they were never to see again, amidst groans and sighs. They embraced each other in the streets, weeping and lamenting over their fatal dissensions. Such as were unable to pay their ransom, and would only quit Jerusalem to become slaves to the Saracens, gave themselves up to all the excesses of despair. But such, in these deplorable moments, was their attachment to the religion whose precepts they had not always followed, that the insults offered to the sacred objects of their worship afflicted them more than their own misfortunes. At length the fatal day 310 arrived, on which the Christians were to quit Jerusalem. All the gates were shut except that of David, by which the people were to go out. Saladin, seated on an elevated throne, saw all the Christians pass before him. The patriarch, followed by the clergy, appeared the first, carrying the sacred vases, the ornaments of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and treasures, of which God alone, says an Arabian author, knew the value. The Queen of Jerusalem, accompanied 311 by the barons and knights, came next. Saladin respected her grief, and addressed some words of kindness to her. The queen was followed by a great number of women, bearing their children in their arms, and uttering the most piercing cries. Many of them drew near to the throne of Saladin, and said to him, "You see at your feet the wives, the mothers, the daughters of the warriors you detain, prisoners. We leave forever our country which they have defended with glory. They helped us support our lives. In losing them, we have lost our last hope. If you deign to restore them to us, they will lessen the miseries of our exile, and we shall be no longer without help upon earth." Saladin was touched with their prayers, and promised to soften the misfortunes of so many bereaved families. He restored the children to their mothers, and the husbands to their wives, who were amongst the unredeemed captives. Several Christians had abandoned their most valuable goods, and bore upon their shoulders, some their parents, weakened by age, and others their infirm or sick friends. Saladin was affected by the spectacle, and rewarded with gifts the virtue and piety of his enemies. He took pity upon all distresses, and allowed the hospitals to remain in the city to tend pilgrims, and assist such as were prevented from leaving Jerusalem by serious illness. When the Saracens began the siege, the holy city contained more than 100,000 Christians. The greater part of them were able to purchase their own liberty. And Volodya-Velin, who was the depositary of the treasures destined for the defense of the city, employed them in procuring the freedom of part of the inhabitants. Malik Adel, brother of the Sultan, paid the ransom of 2,000 captives. Saladin followed his example by breaking the chains of a great number of poor and orphans. There only remained in bondage about 14,000 Christians, amongst whom there were 4,000 or 5,000 children of tender age, who were insensible of their misfortunes, but whose fate the Christians the more deplored, from the certainty that these innocent victims of war would be brought up in the idolatry of Muhammad. Many modern writers have compared the generous conduct of Saladin with the revolting scenes which accompanied the entrance of the first Crusaders into Jerusalem. But we must not forget that the Christians offered to capitulate, whilst the Muslims sustained a long siege with fanatical obstinacy, and that the companions of Godfrey, who were in an unknown land, in the midst of hostile nations, carried the city by assault after braving numberless perils and suffering all kinds of miseries. But we beg to observe that we do not make this observation to justify the Christians, or to weaken the praises history owes to Saladin, and which he even obtained from the people he had conquered. After having done honor to misfortune and consoled humanity, Saladin gave his attention to his triumph. He entered Jerusalem preceded by his victorious standards. A great number of imams, doctors of the law, and the ambassadors of many Muslim princes formed his train. By his orders all the churches, except that of the Holy Sepulchre, were converted into mosques. The Sultan caused the walls and the vestibule of the Mosque of Omar to be washed with rose water, brought from Damascus, and with his own hands placed in it the pulpit constructed by Nuruddin. On the first Friday which followed his entrance into Jerusalem, the people and the army assembled in the principal mosque, and the chief of the imams, ascending the pulpit of the Prophet, returned thanks to God for the victories of Saladin. "Glory to God," said he, "who has caused Islamism to triumph, and who has broken the power of the infidels. Praise with me the Lord, who has restored to us Jerusalem, the dwelling of God, the abode of saints and prophets." It was from the bosom of this sacred dwelling that God caused a servant to travel during the darkness of night. It was to facilitate the conquest of Jerusalem by Joshua that God formally arrested the course of the sun. And it is in the city, at the end of time, will assemble all the prophets of the earth. After having recapitulated the wonders and miracles of Jerusalem, the preacher of Islamism addressed himself to the soldiers of Saladin and congratulated them with having braved so many perils and having shed their blood to accomplish the will of Muhammad. "The soldiers of the Prophet," added he, "the companions of Omar and Abu Bakr, have appointed you places in their holy bands, and expect you amongst the elect of Islamism. Witnesses of your last triumph, the angels on the right hand of the Eternal have rejoiced. The hearts of the messengers of God have leaped with joy. Praise, then, with me the Lord.
Ow.
But yield not to the weaknesses of pride, and do not, above everything, believe that it was your swords of steel, with your horses, rapid as the wind, that have triumphed over the infidels. God is God. God alone is powerful. God alone has given you the victory. He orders you not to stop in a glorious career in which he himself leads you by the hand. The holy war. The holy war. That is the most pure of your adorations, the most noble of your duties. Cut down all the branches of impiety. Cause Islamism to triumph everywhere. Deliver the earth of the nations against which God is angry. The chief of the imams then prayed for the Caliph of Baghdad, and terminated his prayer by naming Saladin. "Oh God, cried he, watch over the days of thy faithful servant, who is thy sharp sword, thy resplendent star, the defender of thy worship, the liberator of thy sacred dwelling. O God! Let thy angels surround his empire, and prolong his days for the glory of thy name. Thus Jerusalem had changed its worship on changing its masters. Whilst the holy places resounded with the sacrilegious praises of the prophet, the Christians departed sadly, plunged in profound grief, and detesting the life which the Saracens had spared. Repulsed by their brethren of the East, who accused them of having given up the tomb of their God to the infidels, they wandered about Syria, without assistance and without asylum. Many died of grief and hunger. The city of Tripoli shut its gates against them. Among this distracted multitude, one woman, urged by despair, cast her infant into the sea, cursing the Christians, who refused them succor. They who directed their course to Egypt were less unfortunate, and touched the hearts of the Muslims. Many embarked for Europe, whither they came to announce, with lamentations, that Jerusalem was in the hands of Saladin. The loss of the holy city was generally attributed to the crimes of its inhabitants. Such was the policy of those times, that it explained everything by the corruption or the sanctity of the Christians. As if crime had not its moments of good fortune, and virtue its days of calamity. There is no doubt that the corruption of manners had weakened the springs of government, and enervated the courage of the people. But the never-ending discords of the Christians did not contribute less than their licentiousness and forgetfulness of scriptural morality in producing the disasters of Jerusalem. When we reflect, likewise, that this weak kingdom, surrounded by enemies, was able to support itself and defer its ruin for 88 years, we are much less astonished at its fall than at the length of its duration. The kingdom of Jerusalem owed its preservation and splendor to the divisions of the Turks and Saracens, and the numerous supplies it received from Europe. It fell as soon as it was left to itself, and its enemies united to attack it. As it was at that time, however, believed that the welfare of Christianity and the glory even of God were attached to the preservation of Jerusalem, the loss of the holy city created throughout Europe as much surprise as consternation. The news of this disaster was first brought into Italy, and Pope Urban III, who was then at Ferrara, died of grief. Christians forgot all the ills of their own country to weep over Jerusalem. It even superseded all other afflictions in private families. Priests carried from city to city images, 312, representing the Holy Sepulchre trampled under the feet of horses, and Christ cast to the earth by Mahomet. Melancholy songs deplored the captivity of the King of Jerusalem and his knights, the fate of the virgins of the Lord abandoned to the insults of infidels, and the misfortunes of Christian children brought up in slavery and in the worship of false prophets. Superstition, joined with despair, created a belief in the most sinister prodigies. On the day Saladin entered into the holy city, says Ricard, the monks of Argenteuil saw the moon descend from heaven upon the earth, and then rescend to heaven. In many churches the crucifixes and images of the saints shed tears of blood in the presence of the faithful. A Christian knight had a dream, in which he saw an eagle, flying over an army, holding in his claws 7 javelins, and uttering, in an intelligible voice, "Evil be to Jerusalem." 313. Everyone accused himself of having brought down the vengeance of heaven by his own offenses. And all the faithful sought to appease, by penitence a God whom they believed to be irritated. "The Lord," said they among themselves, "has poured out the floods of his wrath, and the arrows of his anger are bathed in the blood of his servants. Let our whole life pass away in mourning, since we have heard a voice complaining on the mountain of Shin, and the children of the Lord are scattered." The sacred orators addressed God himself, and made the churches resound with their invocations and prayers. "O powerful God," cried they, "thy hand has armed itself for the triumph of thy justice. Filled with tears, we come to implore thy goodness, in order that thou mayst remember thy people, and that thy mercies may exceed our miseries. Deliver not over thy heritage to shame, and let the angels of peace obtain the fruits of penitence for Jerusalem." The Christian world was for a moment changed. Whilst weeping for the loss of the tomb of Christ, people recalled the precepts of the Holy Scriptures, and became all at once better. Luxury was banished from cities. Injuries were forgotten, and alms were given abundantly. Christians slept upon ashes, clothed themselves in haircloths, and expiated their disorderly lives by fasting and mortification. The clergy set the example. The morals of the cloisters were reformed, and cardinals, condemning themselves to poverty, promised to repair to the Holy Land, supported on charity by the way. These pious reformations did not last long. But men's minds were not the less prepared for a new crusade by them, and all Europe was soon roused by the voice of Gregory VIII, who exhorted the faithful to assume the cross and take up arms. The first care of his sovereign pontiff was to re-establish peace among Christian nations. And with that view he repaired to Pisa, to endeavor to terminate the angry disputes that had arisen between the Pisans and the Genoese. Gregory died without finishing the work he had begun, and left the direction of the crusade to his successor, Clement III, who, immediately after his accession to the pontifical throne, ordered prayers for the peace of the West and the deliverance of the land of the pilgrims. William, 314, Archbishop of Tyre, had quitted the East to come into Europe to solicit the assistance of the Christian princes, and was charged by the Pope to preach the Holy War. William was more able and more eloquent than Heraclius, who had preceded him in this mission, and, further, more worthy by his virtues of being the interpreter of the Christians, and to speak in the name of Christ. After having awakened the zeal of the nations of Italy, he repaired to France, and was present at an assembly convoked near Gisors by Henry II of England, and Philip Augustus of France. On the arrival of William, these two kings, who were at war for the country of Vexin, laid down their arms. The bravest warriors of France and England, united by the dangers of their brothers of the East, came to the assembly whose object was the deliverance of the holy places. William was received with enthusiasm, and read with a loud voice, to the princes and knights, an account of the taking of Jerusalem by Saladin. After this reading, which drew tears from all the assembly, William exhorted the faithful to take the cross. The mountain of Shin, said he, still resounds with the words of Ezekiel, O children of men, remember that day in which the king of Babylon triumphed over Jerusalem. In one single day all the evils that the prophets announced fell upon the city of David and Solomon. That city, filled by all Christian nations, remains now alone, or rather is only inhabited by sacrilegious people. The Queen of Nations, the capital of so many provinces, has paid the tribute imposed upon slaves. All her gates have been broken, and her guardians exposed with cattle in the markets of infidel cities. The Christian states of the East, which caused the religion of the cross to flourish in Asia, and formed the bulwark of the West against the invasions of the Saracens, are reduced to the cities of Tyre, Antioch, and Tripoli. We have seen, according to the expression of Isaiah, the Lord extending his hand and its inflictions from the Euphrates to the torrent of Egypt. The inhabitants of 40 cities have been driven from their homes, despoiled of their wealth, and are now wandering with their weeping families among the nations of Asia, without finding a stone whereon to lay their heads. After having thus described the misfortunes of the Christians of the East, William reproached the warriors who listened to him with not having come to the aid of their brethren, and with having allowed the heritage of Christ to be taken from them. He was astonished that they could entertain another thought, that they could seek any other glory than that of delivering the holy places. And addressing himself to the princes and knights, "To meet you here," said he, "I have traversed fields of carnage. Nay, within sight even of this assembly I have seen preparations for war. What blood is it you have shed? What blood is it you are about to shed again? Why are you armed with these swords? You are fighting here for the banks of a river, for the limits of a province, or for a transient renown, whilst infidels trample the banks of Siloam, whilst they invade the kingdom of God, and whilst the cross of Christ is dragged ignominiously through the streets of Baghdad. You shed torrents of blood for vain treaties, whilst the very gospel That solemn treaty between God and men is being outraged. Have you forgotten the deeds of your fathers? A Christian kingdom was founded by them in the midst of Muslim nations. A crowd of heroes, a crowd of princes born in your country, went to defend and govern it. If you have permitted their work to perish, come at least and deliver their tombs, which are in the power of the Saracens. Does your Europe no longer produce such warriors as Godfrey, Tancred, and the companions? The prophets and saints buried at Jerusalem, the churches transformed into mosques, the very stones of the sepulchres, all cry to you to avenge the glory of God and the death of your brethren. What? Why, the blood of Naboth, the blood of Abel which arose towards heaven, found avengers, and shall the blood of Christ arise in vain against his enemies and his executioners? The East has the all-base Christians, whom avarice and fear have rendered the allies of Saladin. I do not suspect they will find imitators among you. But remember what Christ has said, he who is not for me is against me. If you do not defend the cause of God, what cause will you dare defend? If the King of heaven and earth finds you not beneath his colors, where are the powers whose standards you will follow? Why then are the enemies of God no longer the enemies of all Christians? What will be the joy of the Saracens amidst their impious triumphs, when they shall be told that the West has no more warriors faithful to Christ, and that the princes and kings of Europe have learned with indifference the disasters and captivity of Jerusalem? These reproaches made in the name of religion affected the hearts of the princes and knights deeply. Henry II and Philip Augustus, to that time implacable enemies, embraced each other in tears, and put themselves forward the first to receive the cross. Richard, Duke of Guienne, son of Henry, Philip, Count of Flanders, Hugh, Duke of Burgundy, Henry, Count of Champagne, Thibaut, Count of Blois, Rotrou, Count of Perche, the Count of Nevers, de Bar, Vendôme, Soissons, the two brothers Jocelyn and Matthew de Montmorency, with a crowd of barons and knights, together with several bishops of France and England, all took the oath to deliver the Holy Land. The whole assembly shouted the words, "The cross! The cross!" And this war cry soon resounded through all the provinces. This spot on which the faithful met was afterwards called the Sacred Field, and a church was built upon it to preserve the remembrance of the pious devotion of the Christian knights. As money was wanting to carry out the holy enterprise, it was resolved in the council of the princes and bishops that all who did not take the cross should pay a tenth part of their revenues and of the value of their property of all kinds. The terror which the arms of Saladin had inspired caused the name of the Saladin tithe to be given to this tax. Excommunications were published against all such as refused to pay a debt so sacred. In vain the clergy, whom Peter of Blois undertook the defense, alleged liberty and independence of the church, and pretended they could not be called on to assist the crusaders otherwise than by their prayers. The ecclesiastics were told that they ought to set the example, that the clergy was not the church, and that the wealth of the church belonged to Christ. The orders of the Chartres, of Citeaux and Fontfroid, with the hospital for lepers, were all that were exempt from a tribute, raised for a cause which was believed to be that of all Christians. 315. In the two first crusades, the greater part of the villagers who had taken the cross had done so to emancipate themselves from slavery. Some disorders naturally resulted from this. The country was deserted, the lands were uncultivated. In this crusade means were taken to set bounds to the too forward zeal of the laborers. All serfs who enrolled themselves for the holy war, without the permission of their lords, were condemned to pay the Saladin tithe, as if they had not taken the cross. 316. Notwithstanding all this excitement, the feast which had been sworn to by the kings of France and England was not long held sacred. Richard, who was Duke of Guienne, having had a quarrel with the Count of Toulouse, Henry took up arms to assist his son. Philip flew to the defense of his vassal, and Normandy, Berry, and Auvergne were soon in a blaze. The two monarchs, urged by the solicitations of the nobles and bishops, met for a moment in the sacred field in which they had laid down their arms, but they could not agree upon the conditions of the peace. And the elm tree under which they held their conference was cut down by the orders of Philip. Negotiations were renewed several times without putting a stop to the war. The King of France required that Richard should be crowned King of England in the lifetime of his father, and that he should espouse Alice, a French princess, whom Henry detained in prison. The King of England, jealous of his authority, could not consent to accept these conditions, and would neither yield up his crown nor the sister of Philip, of whom he was enamored. Richard, irritated by his father's refusal, threw himself into the party of Philip Augustus and declared openly against Henry. On all sides they flew to arms, and the produce of the Saladin tithe was employed to carry on a sacrilegious war, which outraged both morality and nature. This war was not a good augury for that which was about to be undertaken in Asia. The Pope's legate excommunicated Richard, and threatened Philip with placing his kingdom under an interdict. Philip despised the menaces of the legate, and told him that the Holy See had no right to meddle with the quarrels of princes. Richard, still more violent, drew his sword, and was on the point of cutting down the legate. He seemed every day to be at a greater distance. In vain, cries of indignation arose from the people. In vain the great vassals refused to take part in a quarrel which interested neither religion nor country. Henry, who consented to an interview, still haughtily rejected the conditions that were proposed to him. He resisted for a long time both the prayers of his subjects and the counsels of the bishops. And the terror only with which the thunder of heaven, which fell by his side during the conference, inspired him, could overcome his obstinacy. He at length accepted Philip's conditions, but soon repented of his acquiescence, and shortly after died of grief, leaving his maledictions to Richard, who had made open war against him, and to his youngest son, who had engaged in a conspiracy against him. Richard accused himself of the death of his father, and, pressed by repentance, he remembered the vow he had made in the sacred field. Now become King of England, he began seriously his preparations for the Holy Expedition. He repaired to his kingdom, and convoked, near Northampton, an assembly of the barons and prelates, in which Baldwin, Archbishop of Canterbury, preached the crusade. The preacher of the Holy War then went through the provinces of England to raise the zeal and emulation of the faithful. 317 miraculous adventures attested the sanctity of his mission, and brought under the banners of the cross the wild and credulous inhabitants of Wales, and several other countries, where the misfortunes of Jerusalem had never been heard of. The enthusiasm of the English for this crusade manifested itself at first by a violent persecution of the Jews, great numbers of whom were massacred in the cities of London and York. A vast many of these unfortunate people found no means of escape from their persecutors, but in a self-inflicted death. These horrible scenes were renewed every crusade. When money was required for the Holy Expedition, it was perceived that the Jews were the depositaries of the general wealth, and the knowledge of the treasures accumulated in their hands seemed to lead the people to remember that it was they who had crucified their God. Richard did not take much pains to repress the misguided multitude, but availed himself of the persecution of the Jews to increase his own treasures. But neither the spoils of the Jews, nor the produce of the Saladin tithe, for the non-payment of which the English were threatened with imprisonment, at all satisfied the King of England. Richard alienated the domains of the crown, and put to sale all the great dignities of the kingdom. He would sell, he said, the city of London, if he could find a purchaser. He went afterwards into Normandy, where the estates permitted him to exhaust that rich province, and gave him full means to support a war in which the whole people took so great an interest. A great number of warriors assumed the cross in France and England, and the preparations for the crusade were finished amidst general fermentation. Many barons and lords, however, did not announce the period of their departure, and delayed, under various pretexts, the pilgrimage to which they had engaged themselves by oath. The celebrated Peter of Blois addressed a pathetic exhortation to them, in which he compared them to reapers who put off beginning their work until the harvest was finished. The Order of the Holy War represented to them that strong and courageous men found a country everywhere, and that true pilgrims ought to resemble the birds of heaven. 318, he recalled to their ambition the example of Abraham, who abandoned his home to elevate himself among the nations, who crossed the Jordan with a staff only, and returned followed by 2 troops of warriors. This exhortation revived the ardor for the crusade, which had evidently begun to cool. The monarchs of France and England had an interview at Nunnan Court, where they agreed to proceed to Palestine by sea. They made, at the same time, several regulations to secure order and discipline in the armies they were about to lead into Asia. The laws of religion, and the penalties that they inflict, did not appear to them sufficient in this case. The justice of these barbarous ages was charged with the onerous task of suppressing the passions and vices of the Crusaders. Whoever gave a blow was to be plunged 3 times into the sea. He who struck with the sword had his hand cut off. He who abused another gave to the person he had offended as many ounces of silver as he had uttered invectives. When a man was convicted of theft, boiling pitch was poured upon his shaven head. It was then covered with feathers, and he was abandoned on the nearest shore. A murderer, bound to the corpse of his victim, was to be cast into the sea, or buried alive. As the presence of women had occasioned many disorders in the First Crusade, they were forbidden to go to the Holy Land. Gambling with dice, or other games of chance, together with profane swearing or blasphemy, were strictly forbidden among the Crusaders. And luxury of the table or in clothes was repressed by law. The Assembly of Nunnan Court made many other regulations, and neglected nothing likely to bring back the soldiers of Christ to the simplicity and virtues of the gospel. Whenever princes, nobles, or knights set out for the Holy War, they made their wills, as if they were certain never to return to Europe. When Philip came back to his capital, he declared his last will, and regulated, for the period of his absence, the administration of his kingdom, which he confided to Queen Adela, his mother, and his uncle, the Cardinal de Champagne. After having fulfilled the duties of a king, he laid down the scepter, to take, at St. Denis, the staff and scrip of a pilgrim, and went to Vézelay, where he was to have another interview with Richard. The 2 kings again swore in eternal friendship, and both called down the thunders of the church upon the head of him who should break his oaths. They separated full of friendship for each other. Richard hastened to embark at Marseille, and Philip at Genoa. An English historian remarks that they were the only kings of France and England that ever fought together for the same cause. But this harmony, the work of extraordinary circumstances, was not likely to exist long between 2 princes acted upon by so many motives of rivalry. Both young, ardent, brave, and magnificent. Philip the greater king, Richard the greater captain. Both animated by the same ambition and the same passion for glory. Desire for renown, much more than piety, drew them to the Holy Land, both haughty and prompt to revenge and injury. They acknowledged, in their various differences, no other arbitrator or judge but the sword. Religion had not sufficient empire over their minds to humble their pride, and each would have thought himself degraded if he had either demanded or accepted peace. To ascertain, at a glance, how little hope could be founded on the union of these 2 princes, it is only necessary to observe that Philip, on ascending his throne, has shown himself to be the most inveterate enemy of England, and that Richard was the son of that Eleanor of Guienne, the first wife of Louis VII, who, after the Second Crusade, had quitted her husband, threatening France with her revenge. After the conference of Gissers, the Archbishop of Tyre repaired to Germany to solicit Frederick Barbarossa to take the cross. This prince had signalized his valor in 40 battles. A long and fortunate reign had rendered his name illustrious. But his age recognized no glory as true but that which was won in Asia. He wished to deserve the praises of his pious contemporaries, and took up arms for the deliverance of the Holy Land. He was, likewise, doubtless influenced by the scruples which his quarrels with the Pope had left upon his conscience, and by his desire to perfect his reconciliation with the Holy See. A general diet was assembled at Mainz. The nobles and prelates would not allow Germany to remain indifferent to a cause which had inflamed the zeal of the other nations of Europe. Frederick, whose devotion they encouraged, descended from his throne amidst general acclamations, and received the sign of the Crusaders from the hands of the Archbishop of Tyre. His example was followed by his son, Frederick Duke of Swabia, Leopold Duke of Austria, and Berthold Duke of Moravia, Hermann, Marquis of Baden, the Count of Nassau, the bishops of Besenken, Munster, Osnaburg, and Passau, with a crowd of barons and knights, likewise, swore to deliver the tomb of Christ. The war against the infidels was preached in all the churches. Happy, said the sacred orders, are they who undertake this holy voyage. More happy are they who never return from it. Among the prodigies that appear to announce the will of heaven, the miraculous vision of the Virgin of Lowenstein is particularly mentioned. She had learned the conquest of Jerusalem on the very day that the Saracens had entered the holy city, and rejoiced at the lamentable event, saying that it would furnish a means of salvation for the warriors of the West. 319. The multitude of those who presented themselves to receive the cross was so great that means were obliged to be taken to repress their ardor. Frederick, who had followed his uncle Conrad in the Second Crusade, was aware of the disorders and misfortunes that might result from too great a number of followers. He refused to receive under his banners any who could not take with them 3 marks of silver, and rejected all such vagabonds and adventurers as had, in the other expeditions, committed so many excesses, and dishonored the cause of the Christians by their brigandage. Frederick, before his departure, sent ambassadors to the Emperor of Constantinople and the Sultan of Iconium to demand freedom of passage through their states, and wrote to Saladin to declare war if he did not restore to the Franks Jerusalem and the other Christian cities that had surrendered to his arms. 320. The embassy addressed to Saladin shows the spirit of the chivalry in which Frederick entered upon this crusade. That which, without doubt, induced him to address the Sultan of Iconium was an opinion then spread through Europe, that the Mussulman prince had evinced a desire of embracing the Christian religion. 321. Frederick left Ratisbon at the head of an army of 100,000 combatants, and crossed Hungary and Bulgaria, as the first Crusaders had done. He arrived in the provinces of the Greek Empire before Richard and Philip had embarked for Palestine. Isaac Angelus was then seated on the throne of Constantinople. This prince had only been brave on one single day, and his courage procured him an empire. Andronicus, the Nero of the Greeks, having been warned by soothsayers that he would be dethroned by one of his subjects, who bore the name of Isaac, desired to get rid of Isaac Angelus, and sent one of his officers to conduct him to prison. Isaac, animated by despair, instead of obeying, threw himself upon the minister of Andronicus, struck him to the earth, and running into the public streets, cried out, "I have killed the devil! I have killed the devil!" Upon the report of this event spreading through the city, the people assembled in crowds and proclaimed Isaac emperor. In vain, Andronicus endeavored to quiet the storm. He was seized by his own soldiers, and loaded with chains. Dragged through the streets by an infuriated multitude, he underwent in one day more torments than he had inflicted upon his enemies during all his reign, and Constantinople beheld a populace 100 times more barbarous than all her tyrants. It was amidst these bloody and disgusting scenes that Isaac was clothed with the imperial purple. He did not possess the savage character of Andronicus, but he was entirely incapable of defending the empire against its enemies. Instead of raising armies, he gathered together in his palace a troop of monks, who kept up his sense of security by their prayers, and turned his attention from the cares and duties of state by their visions and prophecies. The mutual hatred of the Greeks and Latins had increased under his reign and that of Andronicus. The Latins who inhabited Constantinople were driven from the city. Their houses were given up to the flames, and a great number of them were put to death. They who escaped the carnage took refuge in the vessels and galleys and made sanguinary reprisals on the islands and shores of the Hellespont. The monks who surrounded Isaac partook of the blind hatred entertained by the people for the Christians of the West and dreaded their vengeance. They advised the successor of Andronicus to mistrust the Emperor of Germany and to betray him if he did not conquer him. Faithful to their counsels, Isaac promised to entertain the Germans in his states and at the same time formed an alliance with Saladin. He sent orders to his governors to harass the Crusaders and even to attack them by open force. These imprudent hostilities exposed the weakness of the Greeks and were of service to the Germans. 4. Frederick, after having put the troops of Isaac to flight, took every advantage of his victory. Isaac, constantly intoxicated by the incense of his courtiers and seduced by the promises of the monks, only replied to the victories of Frederick by letters full of hotness and menaces. He refused to acknowledge him as emperor and could see nothing but a vassal in a prince who was marching in triumph towards his capital. Whilst his subjects were from all parts flying before the Germans, he gave himself in his letters the titles of most sublime, most powerful emperor, the angel of the whole earth, and caused the ambassadors of Frederick to be imprisoned. The Patriarch of Constantinople preached, by his orders, in the Church of Saint Sophia, the murder of the Latins. Nevertheless, terror at length took possession of the heart of Isaac, and from that moment this prince altered the tone of his language, and became the most humble of suppliants. Frederick was now for him the most virtuous emperor of the Germans, and he voluntarily granted him much more than he had before refused him. After having required hostages, he himself gave them, and fed during several months an army he had sworn to destroy. He endured without a murmur the violences which the Crusaders committed in their passage, and treated an army that laid waste his provinces as if they had saved his empire. The Emperor of Germany received magnificent presents, and all the vessels of the Greek navy were employed in transporting the Crusaders into Asia. The Germans embarked at Gallipoli and crossed the Hellespont. The sight of the coasts of Asia and the easy victories they had obtained over the Greeks made them forget the obstacles and dangers of a long and painful march. They saw nothing in the regions they were about to traverse but laurels to be gathered and kingdoms to be destroyed or founded. But it was not long ere this brilliant prospect disappeared. Whilst they remained in the territories of Isaac, they had to suffer from the perfidy of the Greeks. And when they arrived among the Turks, they had fresh enemies to contend with. The Sultan of Iconium, who had been as liberal of his promises as the Emperor of Constantinople, did not prove at all more faithful to his word. When the Germans arrived on the banks of the Meander, near Laodicea, they found the Turks drawn up in order of battle upon the heights, and ready to surprise them in the defiles. The latter were, however, punished for the treachery of their master, and cut to pieces. Their bodies covered the passages they had been charged to defend. The Crusaders, ever persuaded that heaven protected their arms, attributed this victory to miracles. Several knights declared, upon oath, that they had seen St. George and St. Victor, 322, clothed in white and armed with lances, fighting at the head of the Christians. But the celestial powers that had thus enabled the Germans to triumph over the arms of their enemies did not destroy the obstacles which impeded the march of their victorious army. The Crusaders soon felt the want of provisions in a country ravaged at the same time by the conquerors and the conquered. Snow, rain, and the rigors of winter rendered their march exceedingly painful through a mountainous region, intersected by torrents that had overflowed their banks. Hunger and disease destroyed a great number of the soldiers. To remedy the evils, which threatened his army with entire ruin, Frederick was obliged to attack Iconium, the very capital in which he had expected to find peace, and all the provisions he stood in need of. At the first signal the ramparts were scaled. Iconium was taken by assault, and given up to pillage. The beaten Sultan then fulfilled his promises, and this last victory restored abundance in the Christian army. From this time the Germans spread terror in every country around them. the Armenians solicited their alliance, and the independent tribes of the Turkomans, on several occasions, felt the effects of their courage. During their triumphal march they attracted the admiration of the natives by their discipline. And the emirs, charged with announcing their arrival to Saladin, praised their indomitable valor in fight, and their heroic patience in the labors and fatigues of war. The leader of this formidable army had conquered several nations, and dictated laws to 2 empires, without having yet done anything towards the aim of his enterprise. After having crossed Mount Taurus, near Lorenda, he had resumed his march towards Syria at the beginning of spring, and was proceeding along the banks of the river Salif. 323. Attracted by the freshness and limpidity of the waters, he wished to bathe. But, seized all at once by a mortal coldness, he was dragged out insensible, and soon after died, humbly bowing to the will of God, who would not allow him to behold the land he was going to defend. His death was more fatal to his army than the loss of a great battle. All the Germans wept for a chief who had so often led them to victory, and whose name alone was the terror of the Saracens. The bones of this unfortunate monarch were preserved for the purpose of being buried in that Jerusalem he had sworn to deliver, but in which he could not even obtain a tomb. William, who had been to preach the crusade in Europe, buried the remains of Frederick in the city of Tyre, and pronounced the funeral oration of the most powerful monarch of the Christians. After the death of Frederick, grief weakened the courage of his soldiers. Some deserted the banners of the crusade, whilst the others listlessly and sadly continued their march under the orders of Frederick, Duke of Swabia, who reminded them of the virtues of his father, but was unable to lead them to victory. The contests they still had to maintain against the Saracens, together with hunger, fatigue, and disease, reduced the army of the Germans to 600 or 700 horse, and about 5,000 foot. This miserable wreck of a formidable army crossed Syria, and the report of their disasters, having preceded them, their arrival must have created more terror than confidence among the Christians, who were then carrying on the siege of Ptolemy. Book 8. AD 1188 to 1192. Whilst the crusade was being preached in Europe, Saladin was following up the course of his victories. The Battle of Tiberias and the taking of Jerusalem had created so general a terror that the inhabitants of the Holy Land were persuaded it was useless to endeavor to resist the army of the Saracens. Amid this consternation, one city alone defied and checked all the united forces of the new conqueror of the East. Saladin was exceedingly anxious for the conquest of Tyre, and had twice collected both his fleets and his armies to attack it. But the inhabitants had sworn to die rather than surrender to the Mussulmans. Which noble determination was the work of Conrad, who had recently arrived in the city, and appeared to have been sent by heaven to save it. Conrad, son of the Marquis of Montferrat, bore a name renowned throughout the West, and the fame of his exploits had preceded him into Asia. In his earliest youth he had distinguished himself in the War of the Holy See against the Emperor of Germany. A passion for glory and a love of adventure then led him to Constantinople, where he suppressed a sedition which threatened the imperial throne, and killed the leader of the rebels on the field of battle. The sister of Isaac Angelus and the title of Caesar were the reward of his courage and his services. But his restless character would not allow him to enjoy his good fortune long. Whilst surrounded by peaceful grandeur, he was roused by the fame of the Holy War, and, heedless of the tenderness of a bride or the gratitude of an emperor, he hastened into Palestine. Conrad reached the coast of Phoenicia a few days after the Battle of Tiberias. At the moment of his arrival, the city of Tyre had named deputies to demand a capitulation of Saladin. But his presence revived the courage of the besieged, and changed the face of everything. He caused himself to be made commander, he widened the ditches, and repaired the fortifications. And the inhabitants of Tyre, attacked by sea and land, becoming all at once invincible warriors under his orders, were able to contend with the fleets and armies of the Saracens. The old Marquis of Montferrat, the father of Conrad, who had left his peaceful states to visit the Holy Land, was present at the Battle of Tiberias. Made prisoner by the Mussulmans, He languished in the prisons of Damascus until his children might be able to deliver him or purchase his liberty. Saladin sent for him to his army and promised the brave Conrad to restore his father and grant him rich possessions in Syria if he would open the gates of Tyre to him. He threatened at the same time to place the old Marquis before the front rank of the Saracens and expose him to all the arrows of the besieged. Conrad haughtily replied that he despised the gifts of infidels and that the life of his father was less dear to him than the cause of the Christians. He added that nothing should stop his exertions, and that if the Saracens were so barbarous as to sacrifice an old man who had surrendered himself upon the word of Saladin, he should take glory from being descended from a martyr. After this reply, the Saracens renewed their attacks, and the Tyrians continued to defend themselves bravely. The Hospitallers, the Templars, and the bravest of the warriors that were still in Palestine repaired to Tyre to take part in this glorious defense. Among the Franks who distinguished themselves by their valor, no one was more remarkable than a Spanish gentleman, known in history by the name of the Green Knight. Alone, say the old chronicles, he repulsed and dispersed whole battalions of the enemy. He fought several times in single combat, always overcoming the most intrepid of the Mussulmans, and creating in Saladin the strongest admiration for his courage and his feats of arms. The city did not contain a single citizen that was not an active combatant. The children even were so many soldiers, and the women animated the warriors by their presence and their applause. On board the ships, under the walls, battles were continually fought. And the Saracens, on all occasions, again met with the Christian heroes that had so often inspired them with fear. Saladin, despairing of taking Tyre, resolved to raise the siege and attack Tripoli, but was not more successful in this new enterprise. William, King of Sicily, upon being informed of the disasters in Palestine, sent assistance to the Christians. Admiral Margaret, whose talents and victories had procured for him the surname of King of the Sea and the New Neptune, arrived on the coast of Syria with 50 galleys, 300 knights, and 500 foot soldiers. The Sicilian warriors hastened to the defense of Tripoli, and, commanded by the Green Knight, who had so eminently distinguished himself at the siege of Tyre, forced Saladin to abandon his undertaking. The city and country of Tripoli, since the death of Raymond, had belonged to Bohemond, Prince of Antioch. Saladin, exasperated by his double disappointment, laid waste the banks of the Orontes, and forced Bohemond to purchase a truce of 8 months. The Mussulmans then took possession of Tortosa and some castles built on the heights of Libanus. The fortress of Karak, from which had issued the war so fatal to the Christians, defended itself during a whole year against a Mussulman army. The besieged, destitute of all succor, and a prey to every kind of evil and privation, carried resignation and bravery to perfect heroism. Before they would surrender, says the continuator of William of Tyre, they sold their wives and children to the Saracens, and there remained not an animal in the castle of which they could make food. They were at length, however, forced to yield to Saladin. The Sultan, granting them their lives and their liberty, and restoring to them their wives and children, whom a barbarous heroism had condemned to slavery. Throughout his conquests, Saladin still kept Guy de Lusignan in chains. But when he became master of Tarik in the greater part of Palestine, he at length set the unfortunate king of Jerusalem free, after having made him swear upon the gospel to renounce his kingdom forever, and to return to Europe. This promise, extorted by force, could not be regarded as binding in a war in which fanaticism set at naught the power of an oath on the one side or the other. Saladin himself never entertained an idea that Guy would keep his word. And if he consented to liberate him, it was doubtless from a fear that a more able prince would be chosen in his place, and from the hope that his presence would bring discord among the Christians. Guy was scarcely released from captivity when he made his bishops annul the oath he had taken, and sought earnestly for an opportunity of reconstructing a throne upon which fortune had for a moment placed him. He presented himself in vain before Tyre. that city had given itself up to Conrad, and would not acknowledge as king a prince who had not been able to defend his own states. The king of Jerusalem wondered for a long time about his own kingdom, accompanied by a few faithful attendants, and at length resolved to undertake some enterprise that should draw attention and unite under his banners the warriors who flocked from all parts of Europe to the assistance of the Holy Land. God laid siege to Ptolemy, which had surrendered to Saladin a few days after the Battle of Tiberias. The city, which historians call by turns Akka, Akan, and Acre, was built at the western extremity of a vast plain. The Mediterranean bathed its walls. It attracted, by the commodiousness of its port, the navigators of Europe and Asia, and deserved to reign over the seas with the city of Tyre, which was situated not far from it. Deep ditches surrounded the walls on the land side, and, at equal distances, formidable towers had been built, among which was conspicuous the Cursed Tower, which dominated over the city and the plain. A dike, built of stone, closed the part towards the south, terminated by a fortress, erected upon an isolated rock in the midst of the waves. The plain of Ptolemy is bounded on the north by Mount Cerin, which the Latins called Scolatyrum, the ladders of the Tyrians. On the east by the mountains of Galilee, and on the south by Mount Carmel, which stretches into the sea. The plain is intersected towards the city by two hills, the Turin, or the mountain of the worshipper, and the Matamuria, or the hill of the prophet. Several rivers or torrents descend from Mount Cerin or from the mountains of Galilee, and flow impetuously into the sea at a short distance from Ptolemy. The most considerable of these torrents is the Belus, which discharges itself to the south of the city. In the rainy season it overflows its banks, and forms around it marshes covered with rushes and reeds. The other torrents, whose beds in summer present nothing but an arid sand, overflow in winter like the Belus.
Oh.
During several months of the year a great part of the plain of Ptolemy is underwater. And when summer comes to dry the long flooded fields, the exhalations corrupt the air and spread around the germs of epidemic diseases. Nevertheless, the plains of Ptolemy were fertile and smiling. Groves and gardens covered the country near the city. Some villages arose on the declivities of the mountains, and houses of pleasure dotted the hills. Religious and profane traditions have bestowed names upon several spots in the neighborhood. A little hill reminded travelers of the tomb of Memnon. And upon Mount Carmel was pointed out the retreat of Eli and Pythagoras. Such were the places that were soon to become the theater of a sanguinary war, and see assembled and fighting the armies of Europe and Asia. Guy de Lusignan had but 9,000 men when he laid siege to Ptolemy. But the whole West was preparing to fly to the defense of the Holy Land. The army of the Christians soon became of sufficient magnitude to excite serious alarm among the Saracens. French, English, and Flemish warriors preceded Philip and Richard, under the command of Jacques Stuyvesant, one of the greatest captains of his time, and the Bishop of Beauvais, brother to the Count of Dreux. The Genoese, the Venetians, and the Pisans, with the greater part of the Crusaders from the provinces of Italy, arrived in Palestine under the orders of the Archbishops of Pisa and Ravenna. The cries of alarm of the Christians of the East had resounded even to the north of Europe, where young warriors had taken up arms to combat the infidels. All the nations of the West furnished Jerusalem with defenders, and 80,000 crusaders attacked the ramparts of Ptolemy, whilst the powerful monarchs who had placed themselves at the head of the crusade were still engaged in preparations for their departure. Saladin, who had at first despised the Christians, now thought it prudent to gather his powers together to oppose them. After assembling his army at Damascus, he crossed Antal-Libanus and the mountains of Galilee, and encamped at a short distance from Ptolemy. He pitched his tents and pavilions at the extremity of the plain, on the mountains of Kassan, from whence he could overlook all the sea coast. On one side, his army extended from the river Belus, and on the other as far as Matamuria, or the hill of the mosque. The Sultan occupied all the elevated posts, and all the passages by which the Christians could pass out from the spot upon which they were encamped. Thus the besiegers were besieged, and the army before the walls of the city saw the banners of the Muslims floating around it. The Christians made their entrenchments, dug wide ditches, 324, and raised towers at proper distances around their camp, in order to repulse the attacks of Saladin or the garrison of Ptolemy. The Mussulman army had scarcely pitched its tents when it presented itself in battle array before the trenches of the Crusaders, and fought with them several combats, in which victory was doubtful. In one of these conflicts the Sultan penetrated to the city, and after having ascertained from the top of the towers the position of the Crusaders, he joined the garrison in a sortie, and surprised, and drove them into their camp.
Get out of the way.
By entering into Ptolemy, Saladin revived the courage of the inhabitants and troops. He arranged measures necessary for the providing of supplies. He left them some of his chosen warriors, and gave them for leaders the most intrepid of his emirs, Melchu, the faithful companion of his victories, and Karakosh, 325, whose capacity and bravery had been often tried during the conquest of Egypt. The Sultan then returned to his camp, prepared to combat afresh the army of the Crusaders. The roads of Galilee were covered with Muslim soldiers coming from Damascus. And as Saladin looked daily for the arrival of a fleet from Egypt, which would make him master of the sea, he hoped soon to be able to triumph over the Christians and deliver Ptolemy. A few days after the victory he had gained, a great number of vessels appeared upon the sea, directing their course towards the land. Both armies were filled with hope and joy, the Mussulmans believing them to be a fleet from the ports of Damietta and Alexandria, whilst the Crusaders confidently hoped them to be a Christian armament coming to their aid. The standard of the cross was soon seen floating from the masts of the vessels, which, whilst it excited the liveliest joy in the Christians, equally depressed the Muslims. Two fleets from western ports entered the road of Ptolemy. The first bore the German Crusaders, commanded by the Duke of Guelders and the Landgrave of Thuringia, and the other, the warriors of Friesland and Denmark, who, after having fought the Saracens in Spain, came to defend the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Conrad, Marquis of Tyre, could not remain idle while this war was going on. He armed vessels, raised troops, and united his forces with those of the Christian army. The arrival of the new reinforcements restored the ardor of the Crusaders. The Christian knights, according to an Arabian historian, 326, covered with their long cuirasses of steel, looked, from a distance, like serpents spread over the plain. When they flew to arms, they resembled birds of prey, and in the melee, they were as indomitable lions. In a council, several emirs proposed to Saladin to retire before an enemy as numerous, they said, as the sands of the sea, more violent than tempests, and more impetuous than torrents. The Christians, encouraged by the reinforcements that continued to arrive daily, resolved to attack Saladin and drive him beyond the mountains. They marched out from their entrenchments and drew up in order of battle. Their army extended from the mouth of the Belus to the hill of Turin. The Crusaders, full of zeal and ardor, were commanded by many illustrious captains, among whom the Grand Master of the Templars, the Marquis of Tyre, the Counts of Blois, Bar, and Clermont, with De Bride, and Guy and Gauche de Chatillon, were conspicuous. The clergy even appeared in arms. The archbishops of Ravenna, Pisa, Canterbury, Besançon, Nazareth, and Montreal. The bishops of Beauvais, Salisbury, Cambrai, Ptolemy, and Bethlehem assumed the helmet and cuirass, and led warriors on to battle. The Christian army presented so redoubtable an aspect, and appeared so full of confidence, that a Christian knight cried out, in the height of his enthusiasm, "Let God remain neuter, and the victory is ours." The King of Jerusalem, who caused the book of the evangelists to be borne before him, wrapped in a covering of silk, and supported by 4 knights, commanded the right wing. He had under his orders the French, and the Hospitallers. His lines extended to the Belus. The Venetians, the Lombards, and the Syrians formed the left wing, which was flanked by the sea, and marched under the banners of Conrad. The center of the army was occupied by the Germans, the Pisans, and the English, headed by the Landgrave of Thuringia. The Grand Master of the Templars, with his knights, and the Duke of Guelders, with his soldiers, formed a body of reserve ready to hasten wherever danger or the chances of the day might call them. The guardianship of the camp was entrusted to Gerard Davesons and Geoffrey de Lusignan. When the Christian army was drawn up on the plain, the Saracens issued from their entrenchments and prepared to sustain the shock of the Crusaders. Saladin placed himself with his Mamluks in the center. His nephew Taqi-Eddin Omar, one of his most skillful lieutenants, commanded the right wing, which extended to the sea at the northeast of Ptolemy. The princes of Mosul and Sajir commanded the left wing, bearing upon the river Belus. By this disposition, Saladin enclosed the Christians between the river Belus and the sea, and left them no means of retreat if fortune should favor his arms. The archers and cavalry of the Christians commenced the conflict. At the first charge they broke the right wing of the Mussulmans, commanded by the nephew of Saladin. The cavalry and infantry of the Marquis of Tyre advanced upon the field of battle, the Saracens giving way before them as they proceeded. Pursuing the enemy, who fled in disorder, the Christians ascended the hill of the mosque, and planted there standards in the camp of the infidels. The Count of Bar even penetrated to the tent of the Sultan, which was given up to pillage. An Arabian historian, 327, who followed the army, says of himself that upon beholding the rout of the Mussulmans, he took to flight and did not stop till he came to Tiberias. The terror was so great that several Saracens fled as far as Damascus. Saladin remained almost alone upon the field of battle, and was several times in great danger. 328. Followed by a few of his faithful Mamluks, he endeavored to rally his scattered forces, and at length succeeded in reviving their courage. No sooner had he the means of support, than he returned to the fight with characteristic energy, rushing down upon the Christians, whom he surprised in all the disorder of victory. The Mussulman cavalry now charged in their turn, and dispersed the cavalry of the Franks. The different bodies of the Christian army became soon separated from one another, and in vain endeavored to rally in their flight. The Grand Master of the Templars then advanced with the reserve to support the troops that fled, but he met the Mussulman cavalry in full career that crushed everything in their passage. The reserve was broken at the first shock. They returned several times to the charge, but without being able to stand against the impetuosity of the Saracen horsemen. On all sides, victory was escaping from the hands of the Crusaders. Terror pervaded the whole Christian army, and disorder and confusion reigned everywhere. Whilst the left wing was put to flight, and the body of reserve was making vain efforts to check the Mussulmans, the right wing and the center were attacked not only by the princes of Aleppo, Mosul, and Sajir, with Taqi-Eddin Omar, but by the garrison of Ptolemy, which issued from the city in order of battle. The Saracens made a most horrible slaughter. Every part of the Christian army was broken and put to flight, and utter destruction threatened them if their camp should fall into the hands of the enemy. The conquerors proceeded at once to the attack of the entrenchments, but the height of the walls, the depth of the ditches, and the bravery of Geoffrey de Lusignan and Jacques Davesons, 329, stopped the Mussulman cavalry, and preserved the last asylum of the Christian army. During the contest, Saladin appears to have been everywhere at once. After having re-established the battle in his right wing, he returned to the center, and thence passed to the left. 10 times he crossed the lines of the Christians, and himself directed every charge of his cavalry. The battle lasted during the whole day. In the evening, still many combats were kept up around the camp of the Christians, and night alone brought repose to the two armies. As the Mussulmans and Christians had by turns been victors, the loss was equal on both sides. The Crusaders had to deplore the death of several of their leaders. The Grand Master of the Templars, covered with wounds, was made prisoner on the field of battle, and led to the camp of the infidels. The emirs reproached him with having taken up arms against Saladin, who had generously broken his chains after the Battle of Tiberias. He replied, with haughty firmness, and received the palm of martyrdom. André de Brienne was cast from his horse whilst endeavoring to rally the Crusaders. He in vain implored assistance of his companions, whom fear rendered deaf to pity, and Erard de Brienne, whilst precipitating his flight, trampled under his horse's feet his brother, expiring on the field of battle. The Latin historians attribute the defeat of the Crusaders to an unexpected accident, 330, which threw the combatants into disorder. 331, an Arabian horse, which had been taken from the enemy, escaping in the heat of the battle, was pursued by some soldiers, and it was believed they were flying before the Saracens. All at once a rumor prevailed that the Christian army was conquered and dispersed, and the news redoubled the tumult, and gave birth to general terror. Whole battalions, seized with a panic, abandoned their triumphant banners, and sought safety in a precipitate flight. We only report the singular circumstance to show the spirit of the contemporary chronicles. The fate of the battle might be much better explained by saying that the Christian soldiers abandoned the fight for the sake of plunder, and that the greater part of the leaders, less skillful than brave, neither knew how to prevent or repair the reverses to which an undisciplined army must be exposed. In the plain of Ptolemy, trod by 200,000 warriors, on the morrow was only to be seen, to employ an oriental image, birds of prey and wolves attracted by the scent of carnage and death. The Christians did not dare to leave their entrenchments, and victory itself could not reassure Saladin, who had seen his whole army put to flight. The most frightful disorder prevailed in the camp of the Saracens. The slaves had pillaged it at the commencement of the battle, and had fled, carrying away the booty that escaped the hands of the Crusaders. Both the emirs and soldiers had lost their baggage. Some pursued the fugitive slaves, whilst others addressed their complaints to Saladin. Amid such confusion and tumult, it was impossible for the Sultan to follow up the advantage he had gained, and as winter was approaching, and the Mussulmans were short of provisions, he abandoned the plain, and retired to the mountain Kuruba. The Christians, who now remained masters of the plain, extended their lines over the whole chain of hills that surrounded the city of Ptolemy. The Marquis of Montferrat, with his troops, the Venetians, the Pisans, and the Crusaders commanded by the Archbishop of Ravenna, and the Bishop of Pisa, encamped towards the north, and occupied ground from the sea to the road to Damascus. Near the camp of Conrad, the Hospitallers pitched their tents, in a valley which had belonged to them before the taking of Ptolemy by the Saracens. The Genoese occupied the hill which contemporary historians call Mount Musard. The French and English, who were in front of the cursed tower, were placed in the center, under the orders of the Counts of Dreux, Blois, and Clermont, and the Archbishops of Besancon and Canterbury. Close to the camp of the French floated the banners of the Flemings, commanded by the Bishop of Cambrai, and Raymond II, Viscount de Turenne. Guy de Lusignan encamped with his soldiers and knights upon the hill of Turin, which part of the camp served as citadel and headquarters to the whole army. The King of Jerusalem had with him the Queen Sibylla, his two brothers Geoffrey and Aymer, Humphrey de Thurn, the husband of the second daughter of Amaury, the Patriarch Heraclius, and the clergy of the Holy City. The Viscount de Châtellerault, who was of the same country as Guy de Lusignan, ranged himself under the standard of the King of Jerusalem. The Knights of the Temple, and the troop of Jacques Davesons, fixed their quarters between the hill of Turin and the Belus, and guarded the road that led from Ptolemy to Jerusalem. On the south of the Belus stood the tents of the Germans, the Danes, and the Frisons, these northern warriors, commanded by the Landgrave of Thuringia and the Duke of Guelders, were placed along the shore of the road of Ptolemy, and protected the disembarkation of the Christians, who arrived from Europe by sea. Such was the disposition of the Christian army before Ptolemy, and this order was preserved during the whole siege. The Christians dug ditches on the declivities of the hills whose heights they occupied. They raised high walls round their quarters, and their camps were so enclosed, says an Arabian historian, that the birds could scarcely find entrance. All the torrents which fell from the neighboring mountains overflowed their banks and covered the plain with their waters. And the Crusaders, having nothing to fear from surprise by the army of Saladin, prosecuted the siege without intermission. Their machines battered the walls night and day, and with each morning their assaults were renewed. The garrison, which opposed them with obstinate bravery, could not much longer defend itself without the aid of the Mussulman army. Everyday pigeons bearing mutters under their wings, and divers, who threw themselves into the sea, were sent to warn Saladin of the imminent dangers of Ptolemy. At the approach of spring, several Mussulman princes of Mesopotamia and Syria came to range themselves and their troops under the standards of the Sultan. Then Saladin quitted the mountain of Kuruba, and his army descending towards the plain of Ptolemy, defiled inside of the Christians, with colors spread and drums and trumpets sounding. The Crusaders had soon fresh contests to maintain. The ditches they had dug, to employ the expression of a Mussulman historian, became their own sepulchres, and were often filled with their dead bodies. The hope they had fondly entertained of getting possession of the city vanished at the sight of such formidable enemies. They had constructed, during the winter, 3 rolling towers, similar to those which Godfrey of Bouillon had erected at the taking of Jerusalem. These 3 towers arose above the walls of Ptolemy and threatened the city with destruction. Whilst the Crusaders were engaged in repelling the attacks of Saladin, inflamed arrows and pots filled with burning naphtha were hurled on their machines that were left unprotected at the foot of the ramparts. All at once the Christians saw flames rise in the air, and their wooden towers, seized upon by an unextinguishable fire, were consumed and reduced to ashes before their eyes, as if they had been struck by the lightning of heaven. So great was the terror spread among the Crusaders by this conflagration, that the Landgrave of Thuringia quitted the siege and returned to Europe, believing that God no longer protected the cause of the Christians. Saladin followed up his attacks so incessantly that he left his enemy no repose. Every time that an assault was attempted on the city, the noise of drums and trumpets resounded from the ramparts to warn the Mussulman troops, who then flew to arms and attacked the camp of the Christians. The road of Ptolemy was often covered with vessels from Europe, and Mussulman vessels from the ports of Egypt and Syria. The latter brought supplies to the city, and the former to the Christian army. At a distance might be seen masts surmounted with the standards of the cross, and others bearing the banners of Muhammad, which seemed to mingle and float together. Several times the Franks and Saracens were spectators of the conflicts between their fleets laden with arms and provisions that took place near the shore. At the sight of a naval combat, the warriors of the cross and of Muhammad struck upon their shields, and announced by their cries their hopes and their fears. Sometimes even the 2 armies were so excited as to attack each other on the plain to assure the victory, or avenge the defeat of those who had fought upon the waves. In the battles that took place sometimes on the banks of the Belus, and sometimes under the walls or at the foot of the hills, the Saracens often prepared ambushes, and did not disdain to have recourse to all the stratagems of war. The Christians, on the contrary, placed no confidence in anything but their valor and their own good swords. A car, upon which was raised a tower, surmounted by a cross and a white flag, served them as a rallying point, and was their guiding star in battle. When the enemy gave way, the thirst for booty soon made every man quit the ranks. Their chiefs, almost always without authority, in the tumult of battle, became no more than simple soldiers in the melee, and had nothing to oppose to the enemy but their sword and lance. Saladin, more respected by his troops, commanded a disciplined army, and often profited by the disorder and confusion of the Christians to combat them with advantage and snatch a victory. Every battle began at sunrise, and the Christians were generally conquerors up to the middle of the day. But when even they had invaded and partly plundered the camp of the Mussulmans, and at evening returned home, loaded with booty, they were almost sure to find their own camp had been broken into by the troops of Saladin or the garrison. After the Sultan's descent from the mountain of Kuruba, an Egyptian fleet entered the port of Ptolemy. At the same time, Saladin welcomed to his camp his brother Malik Adel, who brought with him troops raised in Egypt. This double reinforcement revived the courage of the Mussulmans, but they did not long profit by these advantages, and the hope of conquering the Christians began to give way to the most serious alarms. A report was spread throughout the East that the Emperor of Germany had quitted Europe at the head of a numerous army, and was advancing towards Syria. Saladin sent troops to meet such a formidable enemy, and several Mussulman princes quitted the Sultan's army to defend their own states, which were menaced by the Crusaders, coming from the west. Ambassadors were sent to the Caliph of Baghdad, the princes of Africa and Asia, and to the Mussulman powers of Spain, to engage them to unite their efforts against the enemies of Islamism. Whilst terror thus took possession of the Saracens, the Crusaders conceived fresh hopes, and redoubled their efforts to gain possession of Ptolemy before the arrival of the Germans. After several contests, they resolved to make one last attempt to drive the Mussulman army beyond the mountains. Marching from their camp, they presented themselves in order of battle before the Saracens. The Mussulman historians compared their multitude to that which will assemble at the last day in the valley of Jehoshaphat. At the first signal, the two armies approached, mingled, and soon appeared nothing but one horrible, contending mass. Arrows hissed through the air, lances crossed, and the rapid blows of sabers and swords resounded from the bucklers and steel casques. The Christian knights seemed animated with an invincible ardor. The Templars and Hospitallers carried death wherever they directed their course. Syrians and Franks, foot soldiers and horsemen, contended for the prize of valor, and rushed together to meet peril and find victory or death. The Mussulman army could not resist their impetuosity, and at the first charge retired in disorder. The plains and hills were covered with Saracen warriors, who fled, throwing away their arms. Victory remained with the Christians. But soon the thirst of booty led them to abandon their ranks, and the face of the battle was changed. The Mussulmans had time to rally and return to surprise the conquerors, who were pillaging the tent and camp of the Sultan. All at once the Christians were surrounded on every side, and having laid down their arms in their eagerness for booty, could not defend themselves, but were seized by a terror like that with which they had inspired their enemies. The Mussulmans, irritated by their defeat, immolated to their vengeance every Christian that fell in their way. Such of the Crusaders as were most greedy of plunder lost their lives, together with the spoils with which they were loaded, and were slaughtered without defense in the very tents they had invaded. The enemies of God, says Bahauddin, dared to enter into the camp of the lions of Islamism. But they experienced the terrible effects of divine wrath. They fell beneath the sword of the Mussulmans as leaves fall in autumn, under the gusts of the tempest. The earth was covered with their bodies, heaped one upon another, like lopped branches which fill the valleys and hills in a forest that has been cut down. Another Arabian historian speaks thus of this bloody battle: the Christians fell under the swords of the conquerors, as the wicked will fall into the abode of fire at the last day. 9 ranks of dead covered the ground between the hill and the sea, and each rank was of 1,000 warriors. Whilst the Christians were being conquered and dispersed, the garrison of Ptolemy made a sortie, and, penetrating into their camp, carried off a great number of women and children that were left without defense. The Crusaders, whom night saved from destruction, returned to their camp, deploring their double defeat. The sight of their plundered tents and the losses they had experienced quite depressed their courage. And the death of Frederick Barbarossa, with the disasters of the German army, of which they were soon informed, appeared to fill up their cup of wretchedness. The despair of the leaders was so great that they determined to return to Europe, and, in order to secure their departure, were seeking to obtain a disgraceful peace of Saladin, when a fleet arrived in the road of Ptolemy and landed a great number of French, English, and Italians, commanded by Henry, Count of Champagne. Once more hope was restored to the Crusaders. The Christians were again masters of the sea, and might, in their turn, make Saladin tremble, who had believed he had nothing more to dread from them. They renewed their attacks upon the city with spirit. the Count of Champagne, who had restored abundance to the camp, caused to be constructed, at great expense, rams of a prodigious size, with 2 enormous towers, composed of wood, steel, iron, and brass. These machines are said to have cost 1,500 pieces of gold. Whilst these formidable auxiliaries menaced the ramparts, the Christians mounted several times to the assault and were, more than once, on the point of planting the standard of the cross on the walls of the infidels. But the besieged continued to repulse them, and the Mussulmans shut up in the cities supported the horrors of a long siege with heroic firmness. The emirs Karakosh and Melchud were unremitting in their endeavors to keep up the courage of their soldiers. Vigilant, present everywhere, sometimes employing force, and as often stratagem, they allowed no opportunity of surprising the Christians to escape, or to render their attacks abortive. The Mussulmans burned all the machines of the besiegers, and made several sorties, in which they drove the Christians to the security of their camp. The garrison received daily reinforcements and provisions by sea. Sometimes barks stole along the shore, and got into Ptolemy under the favor of night. At others, vessels from Berytus, manned by apostate Christians, hoisted the white flag with red cross, and thus deceived the vigilance of the besiegers. The Crusaders, to prevent all communication by sea, resolved to get possession of the Tower of the Spies, which overlooked and dominated the port of Ptolemy. A vessel, upon which was placed a wooden tower, advanced towards the fort they wished to attack, whilst a bark filled with combustible matters, to which fire had been set, was launched into the port among the Mussulman fleet. Everything seemed to promise success to this attempt, when, all at once, the wind changed, and drove the blazing fire-ship full upon the wooden tower, which was rapidly consumed by the flames. The Duke of Austria, who commanded this perilous expedition, followed by several of the bravest of his warriors, had mounted the tower of the infidel sword in hand. But at the sight of the conflagration which was devouring the vessel he came on, he cast himself into the sea, covered with his own blood and that of the Saracens, and gained the shore, almost alone. Whilst the Duke of Austria attacked the tower, the army left their camp to make an assault upon the city. The besiegers performed prodigies of valor without success, and were obliged to return in haste to defend their own tents, undergoing fire and pillage by the army of Saladin. It was amidst this double defeat that Frederick, Duke of Swabia, arrived under the walls of Ptolemy with 5,000 men, the deplorable remains of a numerous army. When the Christians in Syria had heard of the preparations of the Germans, their invincible powers were the theme of every tongue, and the Crusaders before Ptolemy were animated by the most sanguine expectations. But when they arrived and related the disasters they had undergone, their presence spread mourning and depression throughout the army. Frederick wished to signalize his arrival by an attack upon the Saracens. The Christians, say the Arabian writers, issued from their camp like ants swarming to their prey, and covered the valleys and hills. They attacked the advanced post of the Mussulman army, encamped upon the heights of Al-Hiyat, not far from the mountains of Galilee. Saladin, whom a serious illness prevented from mounting on horseback, caused himself to be carried to Mount Karuba, from whence he could overlook all that went on, and issue his orders. The Christians renewed their attacks several times without producing any effect upon their enemies. And after having fought the whole day, they renounced the hope of a triumph, and returned to their camp, where the famine, which was beginning to be severely felt, allowed them nothing wherewith to recruit their exhausted strength. Every leader of this multitude of crusaders was obliged to feed the troops that he commanded, and they at no time were possessed of more than provisions for 1 week. When a Christian fleet arrived, they enjoyed abundance. But when no vessels appeared for a time, they were destitute of the commonest necessaries of life. As winter approached, and the sea became more stormy, want was necessarily proportionately increased. When the Crusaders made incursions upon neighboring lands to procure provisions, they fought amidst the ambuscades of the Saracens. Animated by despair, they several times attacked the enemy in their entrenchments, but were always repulsed. At length famine began to make frightful ravages in the Christian army. A measure of flour that weighed 250 pounds was sold for 96 crowns, a sum so exorbitant that not even princes could pay it. The leaders insisted upon fixing the prices of all provisions brought to the camp. The vendors then hid them in the earth, and the scarcity was increased by the very measures adopted to lessen it. 332. The Crusaders were obliged to feed upon their horses. Next they devoured leather, harness, and old skins, which were sold for their weight in gold. Many Christians, driven from their camp by famine, took refuge in that of Saladin. Some embraced Islamism to obtain relief in their misery, whilst others, going on board Mussulman vessels, and braving the perils of the sea, went to pillage the Isle of Cyprus and the coast of Syria. During the rainy season the waters covered the plains, and the Crusaders remained crowded together on the hills. The carcasses left on the banks of the rivers, or cast into the torrents, exhaled a pestilential odor, and contagious diseases were very soon added to the horrors of famine. The camp was filled with mourning and funeral rites. From 200 to 300 pilgrims were buried daily. Several of the most illustrious leaders found in contagion the death they had so often braved in the field of battle. Frederick, Duke of Swabia, died in his tent after having escaped all the perils of war. His unhappy companions in arms gave tears to his memory, and, despairing of the cause of the Christians, for which they had suffered so much, returned to the west. To complete their misfortune, Sibylla, the wife of Guy de Lusignan, died with her 2 children, and her death gave rise to fresh discord. Isabella, second daughter of Amaury, and sister to Queen Sibylla, was heir to the throne of Jerusalem. Consequently Humphrey de Thoron, the husband of this princess, immediately asserted her rights. On the other side, Guy de Lusignan could not consent to abandon his, and maintained that the character of king was indelible. No one had the right to deprive him of a crown he had once worn. Amidst these disputes, Conrad, already master of Tyre, was all at once seized with the ambition of reigning over Jerusalem and Palestine. He succeeded in gaining the love of Isabella, induced the council of bishops to dissolve the marriage of Humphrey, and, although himself married to the sister of the emperor, Isaac, espoused the sister and heiress of Baldwin, determined to defend with the sword the rights which this new union gave him. The Christians, though plunged in such horrible misery, and at the same time constantly menaced by Saladin, were entirely engaged by the pretensions of the 2 rival princes. Humphrey, who defended his rights very weakly, was in great dread of the threats of Conrad, and was wise enough not to regret a scepter which he must win, or a wife who had abandoned him. He renounced all his claims, and would have been happy if his docility had restored unanimity. But there remained still 2 kings for an invaded, or rather a nominal kingdom, and the 2 factions divided the army. Some were touched by the misfortunes of Guy, and declared themselves his partisans, whilst others, admiring the bravery of Conrad, thought the kingdom should fall to him who was most capable of defending it. Guy was reproached with having fostered the power of Saladin. The Marquis of Tyre, on the contrary, was praised for having preserved the only 2 cities that remained in the power of the Franks. He alone, they added, could furnish the Christians with provisions, and put an end to the famine which was consuming them. Not one of the Crusaders was ignorant of this quarrel. Dissension spread from the leaders to the soldiers. They heaped abuse upon each other, and were even ready to cut the throats of their comrades to determine who should possess a broken scepter in the vain title of king. The bishops at length calmed the fury of these differences, and persuaded the rivals to refer the matter to the judgment of Richard and Philip. These 2 princes, who had embarked at Genoa and Marseille, met at Messina. Sicily was then at war with Germany for the succession of William II. Constance, the heir of William, had married the Emperor Henry VI, and had charged him with the duty of proclaiming her rights and defending her inheritance. But Tancred, natural brother of Constance, who had obtained the love of the nobility of Sicily, had usurped the throne of his sister, and maintained himself upon it by force of arms against the efforts of the Germans. This prince, not firmly settled on his throne, was much alarmed at the approach of the Crusaders. He feared in Philip, an ally of the Emperor of Germany, and in Richard, the brother of Queen Jane, the widow of William, whom he had ill-treated and still detained in prison. Being totally unable to contend with them, he attempted to conciliate them by his submission and attentions. He at first succeeded with Philip beyond his expectations, but had much more trouble in appeasing Richard, who, immediately after his arrival, haughtily demanded the liberty of Jane, and took possession of the 2 forts which commanded Messina. The English soon got embroiled with the subjects of Tancred, and the banners of England were seen floating over the capital itself. By this act of violence and authority Richard gave great umbrage to Philip, whose vassal he was. The king gave orders that Richard's standards should be removed, and the impetuous Coeur de Lion was forced to comply, though trembling with rage. This submission, although it was accompanied with menaces, seemed to appease Philip and put an end to the quarrel. But from that time Richard became friendly with Tancred, who endeavored to create suspicions of the loyalty of the King of France, and to secure peace to himself, sow dissension among the Crusaders. The 2 kings by turns accused each other of breach of faith and perfidy, and the French and English took part in the hatred of their monarchs. Among these divisions, Philip pressed Richard to espouse the Princess Alice, who had been promised to him in marriage. But the face of circumstances had changed, and the King of England refused with contempt a sister of the King of France, whom he had himself earnestly sought, and for whom he had made war against his own father. Eleanor of Guienne, who had only ceased to be queen of the French to become their implacable enemy, had for a long time endeavored to dissuade Richard from this marriage. In order to complete her work, and create an eternal division between the 2 kings, she brought with her into Sicily Berengaria, the daughter of Don Sancho of Navarre, with the view of marrying her to the King of England. The report of her arrival augmented the suspicions of Philip, and was a fresh source of complaints on his part. War was upon the point of breaking out, but some wise and pious men succeeded in soothing these angry spirits. The 2 kings formed a new alliance bound by new oaths, and discord was for a moment quelled. But a friendship which required to be sworn to so often, and a peace which every day demanded a fresh treaty, were very little to be relied on. Richard, who had just been making war upon Christians, all at once became a prey to repentance and penitence. He assembled the bishops that had accompanied him in a chapel, presented himself before them in his shirt, confessed his sins, and listened to their reproofs with the docility of the humblest of the faithful. Some time after this whimsical ceremony, his mind 333 being naturally inclined to superstition, he took a fancy to hear Abbot Joachim, who lived in retirement in the mountains of Calabria, and passed for a prophet. In a voyage to Jerusalem, this solitary had, it was said, received from Jesus Christ the faculty of explaining the Apocalypse, and to read in it, as in a faithful history, all that was to take place on earth. On the invitation of the King of England, he quitted his retreat, and repaired to Messina, preceded by the fame of his visions and miracles. The austerity of his morals, the singularity of his behavior, with the mystical obscurity of his discourses, at once procured him the confidence and veneration of the Crusaders. He was questioned upon the issue of the war they were about to make in Palestine, and he predicted that Jerusalem would be delivered 7 years after its conquest by Saladin. "Why, then," said Richard, "are we come so soon?" "Your arrival," replied Joachim, "is very necessary. God will give you the victory over his enemies, and will render your name celebrated above all the princes of the earth." This speech, which did not at all flatter the passions or impatience of the Crusaders, could only minister to the self-love of Richard. Philip was very little affected by a prediction which was afterwards also falsified by the event, and was only the more anxious to encounter Saladin, the redoubtable conqueror, in whom Joachim saw one of the 7 heads of the Apocalypse. As soon as spring rendered the sea navigable, Philip embarked for Palestine. He was received there as an angel of the Lord, and his presence renovated the valor and hopes of the Christians, who had during 2 years unsuccessfully besieged Ptolemy. The French fixed their quarters within bowshot of the enemy, and, as soon as they had pitched their tents, proceeded to the assault. They might have rendered themselves masters of the city. But Philip, inspired by chivalric spirit rather than by wise policy, was desirous that Richard should be present at this first conquest. This generous consideration proved fatal to the enterprises of the Christians, and gave time to the Saracens to receive reinforcements. Saladin had passed the winter on the mountain of Kuruba, and fatigue, frequent combats, want, and disease had greatly reduced his army. He, himself likewise, was weakened by a complaint which the physicians could not cure, and which, on many occasions, prevented him from accompanying his warriors to the field of battle. When he heard of the arrival of the two powerful Christian monarchs, he once more, by his ambassadors, called upon the Muslim nations for assistance. In all the mosques, prayers were put up for the triumph of his arms and the deliverance of Islamism. And in every Muslim city the imams exhorted the true believers to hasten to the war. Numberless legions of Christians, said they, are come from countries situated beyond Constantinople, to bear away from us conquests that gave such joy to the Quran, and to dispute with us a land upon which the companions of Omar planted the standard of the Prophet. Spare neither your lives nor your treasures to oppose them. Your marches against the infidels, your perils, your wounds, all, even to the passage of the torrent, is written in the book of God. Thirst, hunger, fatigue, death itself would become for you treasures in heaven, and will open to you the gardens and delicious bowers of paradise. In whatever place you may be, death must overtake you. Neither your mansions nor your lofty towers can defend you against his darts. Some among you have said, let us not go to seek for battles during the heats of summer, or the rigors of winter. But hell will be more terrible than the rigors of winter or the heats of summer. Go, then, and bravely fight your enemies in a war undertaken for religion. Victory or paradise awaits you. Fear God more than the infidels. It is Saladin who calls you to his banners. And Saladin is the friend of the Prophet, as the Prophet is the friend of God. If you do not obey, your families will be driven from Syria, and God will plant in your places other nations better than you. Jerusalem, the sister of Medina and Mecca, will fall again into the power of idolaters, who give a son, a companion, unequal to the Most High, and wish to extinguish the knowledge of God. Arm yourselves, then, with the buckler of victory. Disperse the children of fire, the sons of hell, whom the sea has vomited upon your shores, and remember these words of the Quran, he who shall abandon his dwelling to defend the holy religion, shall meet with abundance and a great number of companions. Animated by such discourses, the Mussulmans flew to arms, and from all parts flocked to the camp of Saladin, whom they looked upon as the arm of victory, and the beloved son of the Prophet. Whilst this was going on, Richard was retarded in his march by interests quite foreign to the crusade. At the moment that his rival was waiting for him to take a city from the Saracens, and was willing to share even glory with him, he made himself master of a kingdom, and kept it for himself. On leaving the port of Messina, the English fleet was dispersed by a violent tempest. 3 vessels were wrecked upon the coast of Cyprus, and the unfortunate crews, who escaped, were ill-treated by the inhabitants and cast into prison. A ship, on board of which were Berengaria of Navarre and Jane, Queen of Sicily, upon presenting itself before Limisso, was forbidden to enter the port. A short time after, Richard arrived with his fleet, which he had succeeded in getting together again, and himself met with an insolent refusal. Isaac, of the family of Comnenus, who, during the troubles of Constantinople, had got possession of the Isle of Cyprus, and governed it with the ostentatious title of Emperor, dared to threaten the King of England. His menaces became the signal for war, and both sides were eager for the conflict. Isaac could not resist the first shock of the English. His troops were beaten and dispersed. His cities opened their gates to the conqueror, and the Emperor of Cyprus himself fell into the hands of Richard, who, to insult his vanity and avarice, caused him to be bound with chains of silver. The King of England, after having delivered the inhabitants of Cyprus from a master whom they called a tyrant, made them repay this service with the half of their property, and took possession of the island, which was erected into a kingdom, and remained nearly 300 years under the domination of the Latins. It was on this island, in the bosom of victory, and in the vicinity of the ancient Amathus, that Richard celebrated his marriage with Berengaria of Navarre. He then set out for Palestine, dragging after him Isaac, loaded with chains, and the daughter of that unfortunate prince, in whom, it is said, the new queen found a dangerous rival. The Franks celebrated the arrival of Richard with feud of joy, lighted up throughout the camp. When the English had united their forces with those of the Christian army, Ptolemy saw beneath its walls all that Europe could boast of as illustrious captains and valiant warriors. The tents of the Franks covered a vast plain, and their army presented a most majestic and terrible aspect. A spectator, on beholding on the coast of the sea the towers of Ptolemy, and the camp of the Christians, in which they had built houses and traced streets, traversed unceasingly by an immense crowd, might have supposed he saw two rival cities which were at war with each other. Each nation had its leader in its separate quarter, and so many languages were spoken by the Crusaders that the Mussulmans could not find interpreters enough to enable them to understand all the prisoners. In this confused multitude, each people had a different character, different manners, and different arms. But, at the signal for battle, all were animated by the same zeal and the same ardor. The presence of the two monarchs had re-established discipline, and Ptolemy could not have prolonged this resistance if discord, that eternal enemy of the Christians, had not entered their camp with Richard. The debates relative to the succession to the throne of Jerusalem were renewed on the arrival of the English. Philip declared for Conrad, which was quite enough to determine Richard to give his voice for Guy de Lusignan. The Christian army was filled with troubles, and again divided into two factions. On one side were the French, the Germans, the Templars, and the Genoese. On the other, the English, the Pisans, and the Knights of the Hospital. The two parties, ready to break into open war, no longer united their efforts or their arms against the Saracens. Whenever the King of France, at the head of his warriors, proceeded to the assault, the King of England remained in his tent in a state of sullen repose. 334, the besieged had never more than one of the monarchs to contend with at once, and the Christian army, after it had received such powerful auxiliaries, became much less redoubtable to the Saracens. Amidst the disputes which divided the Crusaders, both kings fell dangerously ill, and their hatred and suspicion were so great that each accused the other of having made an attempt upon his life. As Saladin sent them refreshments and physicians, and as they addressed frequent messages to him, each party reproached the monarch who was opposed to him with keeping up an impious understanding with the Saracens. The perils of the army, however, with the glory of religion and the interests of the crusade, for a moment stifled the voice of faction and induced the Crusaders to unite against the common enemy. After long debates, it was decided that Guy de Lusignan should retain the title of king during his life, and that Conrad and his descendants should succeed to the kingdom of Jerusalem. It was at the same time agreed that when one of the two monarchs should attack the city, the other should watch over the safety of the camp and keep the army of Saladin in check. This agreement re-established harmony, and the Christian warriors, who had been upon the point of taking arms against each other, now only contended for the glory of conquering the infidels. The siege was resumed with fresh ardor, but the Mussulmans had employed the time wasted by the Christians in vain disputes in strengthening the city. When the besiegers appeared before the walls, they met with a resistance entirely unexpected, whilst the army of Saladin continued indefatigable and unceasing in its attacks. At the earliest break of day, the drums and trumpets constantly sounded the signal for battle, both from the walls of Ptolemy and the camp of the Sultan. Saladin animated his troops by his presence, whilst his brother, Malik Adel, offered an example of bravery to the emirs. Many great battles were fought at the foot of the hills on which the Christians were encamped, and twice the Crusaders gave a general assault. But on both occasions were obliged to return hastily to their tents to defend them against Saladin. In one of these attacks, a Christian knight singly defended one of the gates of the camp against a host of Saracens. The Arabian writers compare this knight to a demon animated by all the fires of hell. An enormous cuirass 335 entirely covered him. Arrows, stones, lance thrusts made no impression on him. All who approached him were slain, and he alone, though stuck all over with javelins and surrounded by enemies, appeared to have nothing to fear. No weapons or force being able to prevail, the Greek fire was at length employed, which being poured upon his head, devoured by flames, he perished like one of the enormous machines that the besieged had burnt under the walls of the city. Every day the Crusaders redoubled their efforts, and by turns repulsed the army of Saladin, or made assaults upon Ptolemy. In one of these assaults, they filled up the part of the ditches of the city with the carcasses of their dead horses and the bodies of the companions who had fallen beneath the swords of the enemy, or been swept away by disease. The Saracens raised up these horrid masses heaped up under their walls, and cast them back again in fragments upon the banks of the ditches, where the sword and lance were forever immolating fresh victims. Neither the spectacle of death, nor obstacles, nor fatigue affected the Christians. When their wooden towers and their battering rams were reduced to ashes, they dug into the earth, and, by subterranean ways advanced under the foundations of the ramparts. Every day they employed some fresh means or some new machine to subdue the place. An Arabian historian relates that they raised near their camp a hill of earth of a prodigious height, and that by constantly throwing the earth up before them, they brought this mountain close to the city. It had advanced within half a bow shot, when the Mussulmans issued from their gates, and precipitated themselves in front of this enormous mass, which grew nearer and nearer, and already threatened their walls. Armed with swords, pickaxes, and shovels, they attacked the troops employed in forwarding it, using every effort to remove it back towards the plain, but were only able to arrest its progress by digging vast and deep ditches in its passage. Among all the Christian warriors, the French distinguished themselves greatly, and directed their efforts principally against the cursed tower, which was erected at the eastern side of the city. A great part of the walls began to fall, and must soon offer a passage to the besieging army. War, famine, and disease had weakened the garrison. The city had not soldiers enough left to defend the ramparts and move about the machines employed against those of the Christians. The place not only stood in need of provisions, but of warlike munitions and Greek fire. The warriors who had gone through so much began to feel discouragement, and the people loudly murmured against Saladin and the emirs. In this extremity, the commander of the garrison came and proposed a capitulation to Philip Augustus, who swore by the God of the Christians that he would not spare a single inhabitant of Ptolemy if the Mussulmans did not restore all the cities that had fallen into their power since the Battle of Tiberias. The chief of the emirs, irritated by the refusal of Philip, retired, saying that he and his companions would rather bury themselves beneath the ruins of the city than listen to such terms, and that they would defend Ptolemy as a lion defends his blood-stained lair. On his return into the place, the commander of the Saracens communicated his courage, or rather his despair, to every heart. When the Christians resumed their assaults, they were repulsed with a vigor that astonished them. The tumultuous waves of the Franks, says an Arabian author, rolled towards the place with the rapidity of a torrent. They mounted the half-ruined walls as wild goats ascend the steepest rocks, whilst the Saracens precipitated themselves upon the besiegers like stones detached from the summits of mountains. In one general assault, a Florentine knight of the family of Bonaguisi, followed by some of his men, fought his way into one of the towers of the infidels, and got possession of the Mussulman banner that floated from it. Overpowered by numbers and forced to retreat, he returned to the camp, bearing the flag he had carried off from the Saracens. In the same assault, Alberic Clement, the first Marshal of France of whom history makes mention, scaled the ramparts, and, sword in hand, penetrated into the city, where he found a glorious death. Stephen, Count of Blois, and several knights were burnt by the Greek fire, the boiling oil, the melted lead, and heated sand which the besieged poured down upon all who approached the walls. The obstinate ardor of the Mussulmans was sustained during several days. But as they received no succor, many emirs, at length despairing of the safety of Ptolemy, threw themselves, by night, into a bark, to seek an asylum in the camp of Saladin, preferring to encounter the anger of the Sultan, to perishing by the sword of the Christians. This desertion, and the contemplation of the ruined towers, filled the Mussulmans with terror. Whilst pigeons and divers constantly announced to Saladin the horrible distresses of the besieged, the latter came to the resolution of leaving the city by night, and braving every peril to join the Saracen army. But their project being discovered by the Christians, they blocked up and guarded every passage by which the enemy could possibly escape. The emirs, the soldiers, and the inhabitants then became convinced that they had no hope but in the mercy of Philip Augustus, and promised, if he would grant them liberty and life, to cause to be given up to the Christians 1,600 prisoners, and the wood of the true cross. By the capitulation they engaged to pay 200,000 pieces of gold to the leaders of the Christian army, and the garrison, with the entire population of Ptolemy, were to remain in the power of the conquerors till the execution of the treaty. A Mussulman soldier was sent from the city to announce to Saladin that the garrison was forced to capitulate. The Sultan, who was preparing to make a last effort to save the place, learned the news with deep regret. He assembled his council to know if they approved of the capitulation. But scarcely were the principal emirs met in his tent, when they beheld the standards of the Crusaders floating over the walls and towers of Ptolemy. Such was the conclusion of this famous siege, which lasted nearly 3 years, and in which the Crusaders shed more blood and exhibited more bravery than ought to have sufficed for the subjugation of the whole of Asia. More than 100 skirmishes and 9 great battles were fought before the walls of the city. Several flourishing armies came to recruit armies nearly annihilated, and were in their turn replaced by fresh armies. The bravest nobility of Europe perished in this siege, swept away by the sword or disease. Among the illustrious victims of this war, history points out Philip, Count of Flanders, Guy de Chatillon, Bernard de Saint Valery, Vaudreuil de Maury, Raoul de Fouquers, Eudes de Gons, Renaud de Mackay, Geoffroy d'Aumale, Viscount de Châtellerault, Jocelyn de Montmorency, and Raoul de Marle. The archbishops of Besancon and Canterbury, with many other ecclesiastics and knights whose piety and exploits were the admiration of Europe. 336. In this war both parties were animated by religion. Each side boasted of its miracles, its saints, and its prophets. Bishops and imams equally promised the soldiers remission of their sins and the crown of martyrdom. Whilst the king of Jerusalem caused the book of the evangelists to be borne before him, Saladin would often pause on the field of battle to offer up a prayer or read a chapter from the Quran. 337. The Franks and the Saracens mutually accused each other of ignorance of the true God and of outraging him by their ceremonies. The Christians rushed upon their enemies crying, "It is the will of God! It is the will of God!" And the Saracens answered by their war cry, "Islam! Islam!" Fanaticism frequently augmented the fury of slaughter. The Mussulmans, from the height of their towers, insulted the religious ceremonies of the Christians. 338. They raised crosses on the ramparts, beat them with rods, covered them with dust, mud, and filth, and broke them into 1,000 pieces before the eyes of the besiegers. At this spectacle, the Christians swore to avenge their outraged worship, and menaced the Saracens with the destruction of every Mohammedan pulpit. In the heat of this religious animosity, the Mussulmans often massacred disarmed captives. and in more than one battle they burned their 339 Christian prisoners in the very field of conflict. The Crusaders but too closely imitated the barbarity of their enemies. Funeral piles, lighted up by fanatical rage, were often extinguished in rivers of blood. The Mussulman and Christian warriors provoked each other during single combats, and were as lavish of abuse as the heroes of Homer. Heroines often appeared in the melee, and disputed the prize of strength and courage with the bravest of the Saracens. 340 children came from the city to fight with the children of the Christians in the presence of the two armies. But sometimes the furies of war gave place to the amenities of peace, and Franks and Saracens would for a moment forget the hatred that had led them to take up arms. During the course of the siege, several tournaments were held in the plain of Ptolemy, to which the Mussulmans were invited. The champions of the two parties harangued each other before entering the lists. The conqueror was borne in triumph, and the conquered ransomed like a prisoner of war. In these warlike festivities, which brought the two nations together, the Franks often danced to the sound of Arabian instruments, and their minstrels afterwards played or sang to the dancing of the Saracens. Most of the Mussulman emirs, after the example of Saladin, affected an austere simplicity in their vestments and manners. An Arabian author compares the Sultan, in his court, surrounded by his sons and brothers, to the star of night, which sheds a somber light amidst the other stars. The principal leaders of the crusade did not entertain the same love of simplicity, but endeavored to excel each other in splendor and magnificence. As in the first crusade, the princes and barons were followed into Asia by their hunting and fishing appointments, and the luxuries of their palaces and castles. When Philip Augustus arrived before Ptolemy, all eyes were for a moment turned upon the falcons he had brought with him. One of these having escaped from the hands of his keeper, perched upon the ramparts of the city, and the whole Christian army was excited by endeavors to recapture the fugitive bird. As it was caught by the Mussulmans and carried to Saladin, Philip sent an ambassador to the Sultan to recover it, offering a sum of gold that would have been quite sufficient for the ransom of many Christian warriors. The misery which so often visited the Crusaders did not at all prevent a great number of them from indulging in excesses of license and debauchery. All the vices of Europe and Asia were met together on one spot. If an Arabian author may be believed, at the very moment in which the Franks were a prey to famine and contagious diseases, a troop of 300 women from Cyprus and the neighboring island arrived in the camp. These 300 women, whose presence in the Christian army was a scandal in the eyes of the Saracens, prostituted themselves among the soldiers of the cross, and stood in no need of employing the enchantments of the Armada of Tacit to corrupt them. Nevertheless, the clergy were unremitting in their exhortations to the pilgrims to lead them back to the morals of the gospel. Churches, surmounted by wooden steeples, were erected in the camp, in which the faithful were every day called together. Not unfrequently the Saracens took advantage of the moment at which the soldiers left their entrenchments unguarded to attend mass, and made flying but annoying incursions. Amidst general corruption, the siege of Ptolemy presented many subjects of edification. In the camp, or in the field of battle, charity hovered constantly around the Christian soldier, to soothe his misery, to watch his sick palate, or dress his wounds. During the siege, the warriors from the north were in the greatest distress, and could gain little assistance from other nations. Some pilgrims from Lubeck and Bremen came to their aid, formed tents of the sails of their vessels to shelter their poor countrymen, and ministered to their wants and tended their diseases. 40 German nobles took part in this generous enterprise, and their association was the origin of the hospitable and military order of the Teutonic Knights. When the Crusaders entered Ptolemy, they shared the sovereignty of it amongst them, each nation taking possession of one of the quarters of the city, which had soon as many masters as it had enemies. The King of Jerusalem was the only leader that obtained nothing in the division of the first reconquered place of his kingdom. The capitulation remained unexecuted. Saladin, under various pretexts, deferring the completion of the conditions. Richard, irritated by a delay which appeared to him a breach of faith, revenged himself upon the prisoners that were in his hands. Without pity for disarmed enemies, or for the Christians he exposed to sanguinary reprisals, he massacred 5,000 Mussulmans before the city they had so valiantly defended, and within sight of Saladin, who shared the disgrace of this barbarity by thus abandoning his bravest and most faithful warriors. This action, which excited the regret of the whole Christian army, sufficiently exposed the character of Richard, and showed what was to be dreaded from his violence. A barbarous and implacable enemy could not become a generous rival. On the day of the surrender of Ptolemy, he committed a gross outrage upon Leopold, Duke of Austria, by ordering the standard of their prince, which had been planted on one of the towers, to be cast into the ditch. Leopold dissembled his resentment, but swore to avenge this insult whenever he should find an opportunity. Richard, forever carried away by his violent and imperious character, desired to command as a master, and alone dictate laws for the whole army of the Crusaders. He endeavored to corrupt the troops of Philip by largesses. He set a price upon infidelity and treason. And Philip, fearing to compromise the dignity of a king in the interests of the crusade by punishing the outrages and perfidy of his rival, resolved to return to France, where fortune offered him more than one opportunity of usefully revenging himself upon the King of England. Philip quitted Palestine, leaving in the army 10,000 foot and 500 horse, under the command of the Duke of Burgundy. On his arrival at Tyre, from which port he embarked, he received a solemn embassy from Saladin, who sent him magnificent presents, and complimented him as the most powerful monarch of the West. He soon arrived in Italy, where the Holy Pontiff praised his devotion, and bestowed upon him the palms of pilgrimage. Welcomed on his return to his kingdom by the benedictions of his people, he carried back the sacred oriflamme to the Church of Saint Denis, and returned thanks to the apostles of France for having protected his life in the glory of his arms amidst the greatest perils. When Philip left Palestine, Richard remained at the head of an army of 100,000 crusaders. After having repaired the walls of Ptolemy and allowed his soldiers some little repose, he passed the Belus, crossed Mount Carmel, and marched towards Caesarea. A fleet from Ptolemy kept close to the shore and transported the provisions, machines of war, and baggage of the Christian army. Saladin, whom Arabian writers often compare to a lioness that has lost her young, upon receiving intelligence of the march of the Crusaders, gathered together his army and set out in pursuit of them. Sometimes getting in advance and attacking their van, at others harassing their flanks, and seizing every soldier that ventured to stray from the main body. Although Caesarea was only 12 leagues from Ptolemy, the Crusaders could not accomplish the distance in less than 6 days. All the Christians who were unable to keep up with the army and fell into the power of Saladin were put to death by his orders, and their bodies left upon the shore as an expiation of the massacre of the garrison of Ptolemy. Richard, who found that peril and obstacles multiplied in his route, desired an interview with Malik Adel, and proposed to make peace, if the Mussulmans would restore the city of Jerusalem to the Christians. Malik Adel replied that the last of the soldiers of Saladin would perish, rather than renounce conquests made in the name of Islamism. Richard, irritated by this refusal, swore that he would obtain by victory that which he could not obtain from Saladin, and gave orders for the army to pursue their march. 341. The Crusaders advanced toward the city of Arcer, marching over a long but narrow plain, intersected by torrents, ravines, and marshes, and covered in many places with fragments of rocks, marine plants, and reeds. They had the sea on the right, and on the left rose the steep mountains of Nauplus, defended by the inhabitants of the country and the troops of Saladin. At every passage of a torrent, at every dune or hills of sand, at every village, a fresh contest had to be sustained, whilst the Mussulman archers, placed upon the heights, annoyed them unceasingly with their arrows. Richard's army marched in order of battle, the cavalry being placed in the center, whilst the foot, closing their ranks, presented an impenetrable wall to the enemy, and braved their constantly renewed attacks. The army of the Sultan got in advance of the Crusaders, and laid waste everything in their way, exhausting their efforts and ingenuity to retard or entirely stop their march. Across the plain of Arcer flowed a torrent which cast itself into the sea near the ramparts of the city. And not far from this point, a wood of oaks, which historians call the Forest of Saren, and which is believed to be the forest celebrated by Tasso, extended along the declivities of the mountains of Naples. It was upon this spot Saladin awaited the Crusaders to offer them a decisive battle. A part of his army covered the heights, whilst the remainder encamped upon the banks of the torrent of Arcer. The Christians soon arrived in face of their enemy and drew up in order of battle. The Danes, Flemings, and Tuscans, commanded by Jacques Stuyvesant, formed the van. Richard marched in the center, at the head of the English, Normans, Gascons, the Syrian troops, and those of the Count of Champagne. The rearguard was composed of French and Germans, under the orders of the Duke of Burgundy and Leopold of Austria. Whilst the archers were showering their arrows from a distance, Saladin passed through the ranks and roused the courage of his soldiers, who replied to him with cries of Allah Akbar. God is powerful. 342. Profound silence prevailed in the Christian army. The black cuirasses of the Crusaders, seeming to darken the horizon, while 60,000 swords gleamed out from amidst clouds of dust. All at once the Christian infantry opened their ranks, and the cavalry rushed forward towards the enemy, drawn up on the banks of the torrent of Arcer. Jacques Stuyvesant, who commanded them, penetrated twice into the closely pressed ranks of the Saracens, and twice was compelled to retreat in disorder. At the third charge, his leg was severed by the stroke of a saber, but he still pursued the infidels, when the arm with which he fought was struck off at a blow. The Christian hero fell amidst the enemy, calling aloud upon Richard, and conjuring him to avenge his death. The King of England advanced with the main body, sweeping away the crowd of Saracens that opposed his passage, and pursuing them to the other side of the torrent. But whilst he yielded to his ardor, and advanced before the Christian army, the chosen troops of the Mussulmans descended from the mountains of Naples, and poured down upon the rear of the Christians. Richard was forced to retrace his steps to support the French and Germans, who were beginning to give way. The plain in which the battle was fought could scarcely contain all the combatants. The Christians and Mussulmans closed and attacked each other man to man. The foot fought pell-mell with the horse, exhorting each other to brave death. The cries of rage, despair, and agony were mingled with the clashing of swords, lances, and shields. The two armies, confounded and mixed together, became nothing but one horrible spectacle. If we believe the somewhat improbable account of an English historian, 343, Richard and Saladin met in the melee, and rushed upon each other, sword in hand, and the two armies instantly became motionless, leaving to their great leaders the honor of deciding the fate of the battle. This singular circumstance, which poetry might envy history, is not mentioned by Arabian writers. 344. The battle lasted almost during the whole day. Towards evening the Mussulmans were broken on all sides, and retreated in disorder into the forest of Saren, whither the fear of an ambuscade prevented the Christians from pursuing them, and destroying the wreck of their army. The Battle of Arcer was one of the most celebrated of this war. In it the Mussulmans lost a great number of their bravest emirs, and particularly regretted the chief of Saladin's Mamelukes, whose heroic courage is highly celebrated by their historians. No Saracen warrior was more prompt to meet danger, and he was always the first to fly to the assistance of his companions, though he himself needed aid from no man. His horse being slain, this brave emir was encumbered with the weight of his iron armor, and received several mortal wounds. Many Mussulman soldiers hastened to his relief, but he was already amongst the inhabitants of heaven. The Christians wept for the death of Jacques Stuyvesant, who had so often shown them the path to victory. In this glorious day the loss of the Crusaders was much less than that of the Mussulmans. Their leaders and soldiers displayed a degree of skill that they had never evinced before. The Saracen cavalry, superior to that of the Crusaders, had not room to perform their usual evolutions with advantage in so confined a field. They attacked the Christians several times with great impetuosity, but the Crusaders withstood them with immovable firmness, and constantly rallied around their great standard, which floated from the summit of a rolling tower. A remarkable circumstance of this battle is that it was principally gained by the infantry, a force which, although held in contempt in the First Crusade, had learned to be redoubtable under the walls of Ptolemy. Richard, who had conquered the Saracens, was not wise enough to profit by their defeat. Instead of pursuing the enemy, or marching straight to Jerusalem, he led his army to Jaffa, the ramparts of which Saladin had demolished, and which the Mussulmans had abandoned. He occupied himself with preparing the fortifications, and sent for the Queen, Berengaria, Jane, the widow of the King of Sicily, and the daughter of Isaac. Surrounded by a brilliant court, he forgot, in the intoxication of pleasure in festivities, the conquest of Jerusalem, for which he had come into Asia. During this fatal repose, he was on the point of losing with his life and liberty the fruit of all his victories. Being one day hunting in the forest of Saran, overcome by heat or fatigue, he alighted from his horse and fell asleep under a tree. All at once, he was aroused by the cries of those who accompanied him. A troop of Saracens was close upon them. He sprang upon his horse, and prepared to defend himself, but was near sinking beneath the force of numbers, when a knight of his suite, named William Porsnett, cried out in the Arabic tongue, "I am the king. Spare my life." 345. At these words, this generous warrior was surrounded by the Mussulmans, who made him prisoner and conducted him to Saladin. The King of England, thus saved by the heroism of a French knight, escaped the pursuit of the enemy, and returned to Jaffa, where his army learned with terror the danger they had been in of losing their leader. Richard formed the project of besieging Ascalon, and Saladin, being doubtful of his power to defend that city, resolved to destroy it. In vain the inhabitants came to implore his pity. In the space of a few days the strongest and most flourishing city of Syria was consumed by fire, and remained nothing but a heap of ruins. The demolition of Ascalon excited great sorrow among the Mussulmans, and the King of England, who had entertained hopes of rendering himself master of the place, was as much afflicted as if he had lost one of his conquests. The city, which had cost the Christians and Mussulmans so much blood, opened at once to the Crusaders the gates of Palestine and Egypt. Richard undertook to rebuild the ramparts that the Mussulmans had destroyed, and led his army into the plain covered by the ruins of Ascalon. It was a curious spectacle to behold 30,000 warriors from the west employed in rebuilding the walls of a city of Syria. The Crusaders, as the Hebrews have been described to us whilst erecting the Temple of Jerusalem, were obliged to work with the sword in one hand, and the tools of masonry in the other. Saladin might have disturbed their labors, but he preferred giving his army a little repose, and recruiting its numbers. Persuaded that the divisions that existed among his enemies would soon work to his advantage, the Christian army obeyed Richard very unwillingly. Leopold of Austria, accused by the King of England of remaining idle with his Germans, contented himself with replying that he was neither a carpenter nor a mason. The greater part of the knights who were thus employed in moving stones and digging ditches were exceedingly indignant, and said aloud that they did not come into Asia to rebuild Ascalon, but to conquer Jerusalem. Whilst the Christian army was in this dissatisfied state, the Marquis of Tyre, who had been ill-treated by Richard, courted the alliance of the Sultan, and promised to restore Ptolemy to him, if the Mussulmans would agree to protect him against his enemies. The King of England, warned of this perfidious negotiation, became only anxious to defeat the projects of Conrad, and himself made propositions to Saladin. He renewed the promise he had made to Malik Adel to return into Europe if Jerusalem and the wood of the true cross were restored to the Christians. "Jerusalem," replied Saladin, "never belonged to you." we cannot without a crime abandon it to you, for in it were accomplished the mysteries of our religion. As to the wood of the true cross, Saladin considered it as an object of scandal, as an insult to divinity. He had refused to give it up to the King of Georgia or the Emperor of Constantinople, both of whom had offered him considerable sums for it. All the advantages to be procured by peace, said he, cannot bring me to restore this disgraceful monument of their idolatry to the Christians.
Yeah, she's got to go with
Richard, who really considered the restitution of the true cross of very little importance, did not reiterate his demand. But as he was desirous of peace,
hold on
he
just a
made
minute.
other
Let me just settle this
in which he adroitly interested the ambition of Malik Adel, the brother of the Sultan. The widow of William of Sicily, the sister of Richard, was offered in marriage to the Mussulman prince. Under the auspices of Saladin and Richard, they might reign together over Mussulmans and Christians, and govern the kingdom of Jerusalem. The historian Ahmed was charged by Malik Adel with the task of communicating this proposition to Saladin, who appeared to adopt it without repugnance. 346. The project of this singular union created great surprise among the imams and doctors of the law. And the Christian bishops, when they were informed of it, expressed the strongest indignation, and threatened both Jane and Richard with the thunders of the church. The execution of this plan appeared impossible in the midst of a religious war, and everything leads us to believe that Saladin only affected to give it attention that he might gain time to fortify Jerusalem, which the Christians still demanded of him. Skillful workmen from Aleppo were, by his orders, employed in widening the ditches and repairing the walls. Among the Mussulman workmen were 2,000 Christian prisoners, condemned to rebuild the fortresses occupied by the infidels. Saladin encouraged the labors by his presence and his example, animating the zeal of the people and soldiers by frequently reminding them of the victories of the Mussulmans and of the massacre of their brethren slaughtered before Ptolemy. The conquest of the Holy City was the object of the war, the great reward promised to the labors of the Crusaders. And they at
can wake her up and get her to agree, that's also okay. I'm sorry. Let's see. Well, we almost made time, but we didn't. So I'm gonna have to sign off, and I'll get back. I'll get back on it. It's been a tough morning, actually. Pretty hardcore. But anyway, we learned a lot about the Michaud's version of what happened in the Crusades, Volume 1, of 3. Right. So we'll be back again soon. Take care.